north they call them hammer seals, for the noses they carry look very much like hammers. Little Brainer was fascinated by them, her rather pointy nose wrinkled in fascination as she stared at them, clearly caught halfway between looking at them and wanting to turn away. They are so ugly. Nothing like the cute seals that sometimes waddle around the beaches at home. She blurted out, her words setting off a flurry of giggles between her and her new friend as they peeled off then to walk down the ship, keeping the loud animals in their sights and even beginning to name some of them, Sir Roble making sure to keep himself between his charge and the sides of the boat. I envy how easily they can make friends at times, he said into the warm silence they left behind, the city now closer than ever and G. Harry's with it. Just a smile and a word to make fast friends and oftentimes not much more to make them lifelong. We adults claim wisdom yet the friends we tend to carry in our hearts are most often from when we were less wise. There's a noble house in Dawn called House Ovo, sandy Dornish nobility of the pettiest sort with skin as golden as butter. Their words are no new friends. He smirked at the end, his black eyes hidden in the wrinkles of his smile. Sounds lonely, she offered, not really listening nor caring. I will always support the making of friends, Prince Oberyn. It was friendship that nearly ended House Targaryen when the northern kingdoms arose in rebellion. It was the promise of friendship with House Tyrell that stopped the encroachment of those same armies when they were intent on the blood of my children and grandchildren. Friends are favor, so long as they are not false. He said nothing to that, just a snake coiled at her side with sharp eyes and a sharper smile that didn't connect. And thus, we sail into the freezing maw of the northernmost of those rebellious kingdoms now, a paltry few Dornish and Crown land royals. To seek perhaps more friends. With a bare 2 noble knights at our backs. And 200 men at arms, too noble to bleed wrong. The word noble virtually oozed out his mouth, derision and disdain as heavy on his tongue as the cloves of garlic were on that ghastly drink he partook at meals. We chance much with this trip, my queen. She turned to face him full on then, her ire up at his doubt and unasked for opinions. If she'd wanted to be second-guessed and challenged at every turn by a Martell, she'd have sooner stayed in the Red Keep and had Elia do it. I am a grandmother, Prince Oberyn. She snapped then, her raised voice drawing looks from the ship's crew in near proximity, the children thankfully too far to register her displeasure. Thank the 7 for ugly seals. Thrice over, as much as you and the rest of the court would rather forget G. Harry's existence, packed away to these northern wastes as he was. I feared Aerys, for though he was a curse in a crown he was king and there was none higher than he. I will not fear Starks or any other who rightfully bows at my family's feet. That little boy has come to some ill turn in this blasted tundra, and I mean to see for myself that he is recovered. Letters and scrolls may suffice for you and your sister, but the blood of old Valyria requires more. The rocking of the boat in the choppy waters was the punctuated cap on the end of her gale and for a few moments nothing was said, just 2 people watching a white stone city draw nearer, the massive grey stone wharf visible from the ship. And if the boy is happy with his wolfish clan in their wolfish den? He asked softly, his words ringing the bell of doubt that had been placed in her stomach when she'd first learned that he was leaving for the north. Would I tear him from what little happiness he has known just to ensure that he does not forget us, and I him? His melancholy sweetness that none of my son's other children inherited. You're correct, my queen, I bear the boy no great affection but neither do I loathe him. A boy of barely 7 name-a-days has very little he can do to be worth hating. He uttered a cool temperance to his voice that was quickly cast aside for steely resolve. My only concern is as ever, for my sweet sister and the children of her body. If G. Harry's waters is content playing in the snow, I say let the snows have him. Snow, ice, and the occasional wilderling is infinitely kinder than the court of King's Landing. It was a truth the licentious brother of Elia spoke, but that didn't mean it was welcome. She could easily recall how appallingly lonely the boy had been, more friends with Sazlerain and Menlik than any of the other children his own age or near it. Of course, the children of those grasping lickspittles would shun that boy for fear of displeasing his royal siblings, at the urging of their parents of course. She'd almost wished they were a commoner family, so that she might have Rhaenys swatted on her bum for the bratty tricks and japes she'd inflicted on the boy. She and Elia had come to be allies and near friends of a sort over the years, united in most things but especially regarding the safety and prosperity of their family, but when she'd approached her to ask her to legitify the boy and give him his father's name, she'd seen a wrath that was worthy of her deceased friend in her eyes when she refused. Ruller had very little experience with expressing her own wrath, the years spent under Aerys Talon Thumb taking their toll, but she was happy to learn. Their fight that day had been fierce, Ruller's bellows worthy of the battlefield and Elia's hand white around that cane she carried as if she'd wanted to give her a blow on the head, but luckily it hadn't come to such a scandalous climax. Ruller had her supporters and allies, but she was not the mother of the king. Just his grandmother. She'd left unhappy and fuming, to the point that she'd directed a protesting Sakastan to perform an indignity upon a Targaryen heirloom that Aerys would have happily flayed her for if he'd still been around to bid it so. That same indignity was on board, stashed in her cabin under her bed with none the wiser. Even if the boy was truly happy in his muddy squalor, she'd leave him with something to remind him of the legacy of the blood he bore. No son of Rhaegar would ever simply be just a wolf. If he has found a measure of joy here, then I will leave him to whatever happiness he has here, Prince Oberyn. She stated plainly, wanting this conversation to be done bleeding into her voice. But first I will hug him, smell his hair, and kiss his cheeks, feeling his warmth and remind him that he is the blood of the dragon and that is not something to be cast aside. She frowned then, her white brows meeting in agreement. Dea Persis Sarpes of Ahasi Persis Jorah. He looked askance at her then, his quick mind at work behind those dark eyes as he looked at her in confusion. No flame so loyal as the flame unloved. She finished for him neatly, her eyes hard as they met his. My grandfather Aegon was the youngest son, and there was no thought of him. His parents busy, siblings proud except for one, and he was unloved. Where did he find love, my prince? With the commons. And he went to legislative war with the nobles on their behalf. He wasn't wrong to love those who do so much for our benefit, but his zeal was at odds with his goal. I seek to keep our blood united, rather than at odds. She left the deck then, calling for her youngest as the wharf was growing ever closer, and so was the welcoming party bearing the murmur of House Mandaeli that waited upon it. They had arrived. Asterisk 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 asterisk. The road to Winterfell was long and worn, the remembered treads of wheels and spokes from countless travels to and from the castle making the ride passably easy for their party, the 200-strong party plus the additional 50-man Mandaeli nightly escort that invited themselves along, the enormously fat Lord Zessa Willis and his 2 young daughters who had an opulent carriage to themselves, where Ruller and Daenerys were currently enclosed. She'd hoped that Daenerys would find the same easy friendship she'd formed on the ship with Lady Braina Dane, but the 2 girls were the picture of northern chilly courtesy on their side of the carriage. They answered every question that was directed towards them, but laconically so, little round faces shuttered and flinty around the eyes. The older girl, Winifred, was of an age with her Rhaenys but not as pretty, though she had her own charms with the rose of her cheeks and rosebud mouth. Rhaenys was her mother's shade, down to the thin Martell lips. Rhaegar just gifted her his eyes and chin and little else, mayhap that famed Targaryen vigor that her mother so desperately needed. The younger girl, Wyler, was an apt mimic of her older sister's coolness, yet there was a fire chained in her manner that promised trouble in the future for her rotund father. Her Daenerys was eager to make more friends, so she chattered at the girls at the start of their journey, but even a girl of 6 nowadays can gather when someone had no care for friendly overtures. Her girl was now merely resigned to looking out the windows at the blood-colored grass and the occasional black-barked tree. She'd invited Braina to ride with them, fearful of losing time with her friend, but the Dane girl politely declined, choosing instead to ride astride between her mother, the recovered Lady Ashura, and Prince Oberyn. Her whoops and cheers were heard even within the carriage, and at each joyous exclamation her Dany wilted even more in a sullen sort of unhappiness. She'd just adjusted her arm around her babe and pulled her head onto her breast when the heavy knock of a steel-enclosed fist tapped the side of the carriage and set her off again. Her boundless energy returned at the sound. "My queen, the castle has been sighted," was the muffled explanation from Sir Castan, and at that she pulled back the curtain to get her first glance at the seat that had sequestered her grandson for the past year or so. Winterfell was gargantuan in its scale, a grey stone fortress that dwarfed most castles of the realm, barring a select few. She saw the towering granite walls, each seeming to reach for the clouds above, and beyond that, the snapping direwolf banner that snapped in the wind, obviously chilly for the way the back of the Martell prince was hunched under his gifted furs. She recalled the lessons of her childhood, where Grandmaster Pycelle had declared that only Casterly Rock, abode of lions, Harrenhal and perhaps the Red Keep was larger. That old treacherous whoremonger was wrong in his claims. The Red Keep was easily smaller, more meant to ring proudly to all the power and wealth of House Targaryen. Winterfell just spoke to permanence instead. As if the castle had and will always be there, for what is the North without its stony heart? Lady Braina was silent now, her cheer replaced by amazement as they drew ever closer to the seat of her deceased father, that rash boy who helped put House Targaryen in the direst of straits in 100 years. She bore him no ill will, but what madness caused him to think there'd be any ending but the one he'd met, riding into the dragon's den and baying for royal blood. The approach to the great castle of the North thawed even the icy courtesy of the Mandaly girls as they too bent to gaze out the window, dramatic gasps escaping both as they looked upon the stark seat for perhaps the first time, going by their reactions. "It's bigger than Newcastle." The older girl hissed to her sister as she pulled her back to her seat, remembered decorum driving her actions as the younger girl whined at the loss of view. "It's bigger than most castles, truly," Rolla offered, the olive branch of her smile reciprocated by Winifred but not Wyler. "My childhood lessons with the Grandmaster says it's so large because the Starks would open their walls to the people of the North when winter hits its hardest. The North is very different from the southern kingdoms in that way. White Harbor has the slate stones for bad winters, where poor peasants can shelter out the bad days." Wyler gave the words out neatly, her brown eyes bright and shining, clearly proud of her house's similarity to House Stark. "My lord grandfather started building them when he was just a young lord after his father passed of a chill, and he'd finished them by the time our Uncle Wendell was born. The North must hold together as one," she declared, her eyes firm in their distaste for present company. "It's no wonder that Elia couldn't find a northern knight for the Kingsguard. These people don't worship the Seven or the old gods. They worship House Stark." After that assertion, Rolla looked outside once again, only for the dark eyes of Prince Oberyn to meet hers for a split second as he drifted back, misery plainly seen in his shaking body, the velvet and ermine furs proving little barrier to the sweeping cold they braved. His eyes, so like his sister's, brought back to mind the secondary reason for this trip north. "We will offer the hand of the Princess Rhaenys to Lord Stark's heir, should you find him of a good character and agreeable nature. There will be many in the south who will gnash their teeth and grumble, but if this can allay any notions of northern secession, I would see it done." Rolla had heard the row between the royal siblings from down the hall, Oberyn showing a decidedly uncommon sort of concern for his niece's well-being and open dislike of offering her upon a gilded platter to those who it was said still loathed the dragon banners. Elia had been as she ever was, firm and unyielding in the face of her siblings' ire even as she extolled the gains of such a match. House Stark had turned the North's fortunes around and was rife with gold and plenty, so the crown princess would not lack for anything. As well as the fact that Eddard Stark had treated openly with her in their first and only meeting, which was the sign of a man who didn't regard women as less than. Surely his son would hold similar views as his father. Rolla would be saddened to lose another grandchild to the freezing North, but such was the way of politics and ruling. Children are the mortar with which bridges are built. "We are close, my queen," was all that Oberyn said before he cantered off, surely dreaming of warm rooms and a hot meal. Dany, who'd begun to doze against her shoulder, was awoken with a nudge, the expected whining making the carriage seem even smaller as the road beneath them transformed from dirt to cobblestone, the jarring jumps giving way to a much smoother experience. Looking out the window, she saw stone homes and other telltale signs of life and industry, a marketplace that seemed rather sprawling for what she'd been led to believe would be the present. The familiar sight of peasantry intermixed with even some people who looked like no one she'd ever seen before, small with ink-black hair and almond-shaped eyes. There were more buildings currently in the process of being built, the carts and wheelbarrows laden with materials attesting to the industrious bend of House Stark. Dany just leaned over her, ewing and ahhing at the unfamiliar sights, unseeing of the hardened eyes that looked upon the men bearing the dragon of House Targaryen, or the occasional spitting that happened when they saw the little silver-haired girl in the window peering out at them. "These people will never love us," and not for the first time she cursed Aerys' malicious brutality and lamented Rhaegar's insanity. "How ill they must have treated my grandson," the living reminder of the woes House Targaryen visited upon these lands. Before she was ready they were passing under the massive gatehouse, temporarily casting the entire carriage into shadow before they were ushered into a massive courtyard, more telling signs of construction abandoned briefly as the castle's inhabitants gathered to greet their royal guests. Sir Castan was already there, his hand extended and waiting for her own. She took it, but her eyes were already moving over the assembled bent heads of the Stark family. Later, her knight would complain of how Ned Stark was already rising before she'd bid them to, and how these petty treasons were proof of how they'd gotten off too lightly at the end of the rebellion. But at the moment, all she had eyes for was the face of her grandson, standing off to the side next to the tully-looking Stark heir. He looked happy, well-fed and content. He was never easy with his smiles, for the realm never gave him much reason to be, but he was smiling now, a dark-haired toddler clasping his knee as she babbled to him. There was such a brightness to him that it nearly hurt to behold him, as if his happiness was a candle that lit him from within. She looked away from him for a moment, her eyes meeting the stony grey of Lord Eddard Stark as he offered her the expected words of courtesy. His wife, Lady Catelyn, was more genuine in her welcome, and she remembered that House Tully had long been friends to the dragons. Her daughter was her miniature, perfect in her courtesy and gracious in her bearing. But it was when she met the eyes of the heir, she saw a wall of loathing emanating from his blue eyes, his father's chin and facial length showing through the Tully colouring as he openly frowned at his guests. His hand was on his cousin's shoulder, the grip possessive and his chin challenging in its tilt, his wanting them anywhere but there evident for all to see. This one holds no love for us at all. I suspect whatever notions of betrothal Elia had will die on the vine, for even if his father were willing, I can see that the boy will not have it. Finn. Chapter 13. Notes. Been a struggle, and just glad I've got this far. Chapter text. Chapter 13. Winterfell, the North 292. Catelyn. They were slowly suffocating, choking on a miasma of mistrust and hostility that clouded the hallways of the castle of Bran the Builder. Winterfell was a massive and sprawling edifice of grim grey stone, a patchwork of differing structural trends that somehow melded into a dull picture of continuous lastingness, a sharp distinction from the home of her youth, Riverrun. The angular sandstone gem that neatly sat in the clasp of the Tumblestone and Red Fork could fit inside the walls of her husband's seat 2 times over with room for another portion, yet for all her memories of the many feasts she'd helped arrange as the Lady of Riverrun, she can honestly say it never felt so small as Winterfell has since the banners of the 3-headed dragon and the Son of Dawn descended on it. The great hall was muted, the generally unruly Northmen quieter in their manner, a cold and hard edge of distaste in nearly every eye whenever they caught sight an unfamiliar face or worse, an accent that mayhap grated danced around their ears. The southern party was just as vicious in their reciprocal contempt, laughter leaning toward forced as they added volume to their merriment, knowing that it was knives on stone to their captive audience. Her own husband wasn't much better, his chilly cordiality an open tell of his unhappiness with their presence in his hall. Eddard Stark wasn't the sort of lord to display boorish manners to even those he disliked, but he wasn't some silver-tongued courtier to drop sweet falsities in any open ears he found turned his way. He spoke, suffered inane small talk, and observed all the expected niceties, but his grey-stark eyes told any and all willing to truly see that dragons and their kin weren't truly welcome in the north. Compounding his glacial courtesy was the evident pain he was still in. The nightly bandage changes required for his mutilated hands that now mirrored their sons and nephews were a sore issue between them, the hands that had become so familiar to her now wrong, alien in their feel and patterns. Maester Lewin when available cleaned the maimed areas and changed the linens, but with so many guests present his attendance was limited at times, so he'd made sure to show her what the necessary treatment was and how to proceed with them. Ned had apologized the first night she had to fill in for Lewin, his own private struggles with doing it himself making his similarities to Robb apparent in a way that most would never see of the Lord of Winterfell. Robb was present in the sheepish lift to his lips as she bid him to sit, both chagrin and fondness bright in his eyes as he awaited her ministrations quietly. She'd merely hummed and took over from him, forcing herself to not flinch away from the sight of the nubbed little fingers on each hand, instead focusing her mind on the issues of the day. The constant candles needed in the library as Oberyn Martell insisted on staying up to all odd hours, poring over tomes and scrolls when he wasn't pestering or glowering at her husband. The extra blankets needed by Lady Dane and her child, as if they already weren't enjoying the warmest guest chambers in the castle. The many stilted conversations with the Dowager Queen where all she'd asked about was her grandson and his happiness. Did he laugh openly? Did he hide his mirth away? Did he ever lead Rob in any adventures, or was it always Rob pulling him along? Did he ever ask about his parents? Was he allowed to ask after Roriga here? Did they tell him of Ace and his madness? Did he prefer G. Harry's or John? Her lovely but lined face fell when Caitlin gently informed her that John was his chosen name, not G. Harry's. Clearly, the Dowager Queen had travelled countless leagues to see her youngest grandchild in the hope of finding a young boy with filial draconic glory stamped on his heart, some tempestuous little firebrand with dreams of Eamon the Dragon Knight or Daeron the young dragon chasing his thoughts. Instead, she found a boy who favoured his grim uncles, one who would be hard-eyed and dull but for the ministrations of his maternal family. Ned, who was the father he'd sorely lacked, Rob the brother he'd been denied by the machinations of court. Benjen the playful and patient Uncle Viserys never was. Little Arya who was his laughter and sweet Sansa who was his peace. And even she, who if not his mother, was the closest thing he had to one cat. Ned's soft purr drew her back into the room, her hands still patting the fresh bandages, intuition from patching scraped knees and elbows carrying her through the motions. "Where did you go?" His soft grey eyes were on her, bemusement clear in his tilted head and words. Her smile was wry and sad as she lifted the freshly bandaged hands to her lips, dropping a feather-light kiss on the knuckles before she lowered them to her lap, her eyes meeting his as she took in his face, the hard pain of his jaw and the tired shadows under his eyes. "I was thinking of the Dowager Queen, and just what her being here really means for us and the North," she began, her hands putting away the supplies she'd doubtlessly be using again the next evening. "My father once told me if a royal visits, the mire is deep. No one would bother undertaking such a journey if they could feel the bottom." Her father's many lessons had been drilled into her, back in those bright years before Edmure was born. Before her mother bled out for the heir her father needed. She hadn't necessarily enjoyed being the heir to Riverrun, but she'd felt her parents' regard for her, her father's concern for her, his observant eyes always a tangible weight on her as she went about her duties around the castle. Her mother was proud, her smile sweetly triumphant whenever Caitlin had stood behind her father as he'd held petitions in court. But those days were lost to blood, tears, and time. She saw that same withered age in Queen Rhaella Targaryen, her fears bright in her red eyes. "Maya." Her husband growled the word, his face stony in its disdain. "If there is a Maya, it is one of their own making. And yet they would bring their muddy hands and greedy eyes to the north, to Winterfell itself. They will have nothing from us. Nothing more than what they have already stolen from me." She squeezed his hands gently, mindful of the still tender portions she'd just wrapped. "More offers for the boys?" Her words were gently said, patience confirming her question. He snorted then and gained his feet, pacing to the window behind them, shut against the chilly northern evening air. "They are relentless." His manner of complaint was no different from Rob's when the Maester would tell them he could use extra time for study or some work. The Dowager near demands Rob's hand for Princess Rhaenys, promising a royal dowry to accompany her and a likely future monarch with Stark blood on the Iron Throne. The Martell is even worse, pushing Jon for his niece, praising the honor and privilege of a life as the prince consort of Dawn. The dragon is polite enough to reserve her offers to private meetings in Mysola. The Dornish man. In the courtyard, in the training yard, when I speak to Veon or Roderick. They will have neither. Here he vowed it, the broad shoulders she loved tense with anger. Rob is for the Mandaeally girl and Jon is meant for Sansa. The gods themselves have willed it, I care not what royal tempers I offend. Not to mention I refuse to see Jon wed into that family. Not after the insult Lyanna and Roriga dealt them. He'd be found dead in his sleep within a year of his wedding. She breathed a familiar sigh, an old argument trapped behind that release of air and frustration. "So husband, how do we tell both the Dowager and the Prince Oberyn that neither offer will be accepted?" she asked, tiredness heavy in her bones. "You've used discussions with me as an excuse to not commit either way, but their departure south draws nigh and we cannot expect them to be less forceful if they haven't received a firm answer." Grey eyes that matched storm clouds glared at her from his spot at the window, an eruption of ire trapped behind typical Stark stoicness, but his face told it true. The clench of his teeth and square of his jaw spoke to just how much he wanted his castle back, free of any southern interlopers and their machinations. "I will tell them in the same manner it was told to me that I'd be sent off to ward in the Vale with Jon and Robert. What they want will not come to pass, and what will be has already been decided. Any objections or reproaches they hold, don't concern the North." Her shriek of laughter cut through the room at that, Ned's brows knitting together in mildly confused offense. "You mean to tell the Dowager Queen, and the Princess Mother behind her, the Regent of the Seven Kingdoms, that the hand of the Crown Princess is not desirable enough for our son? And in the same manner, brush away the hand of the heir and only daughter of the Prince of Dawn?" She was choking on her mirth then, holding a wad of clean wraps to her mouth to stifle her noise. She coughed here, "and then tell them that any issues they may hold with our refusals, don't matter to us." She stopped then, to wipe her eyes and reshuffle the bandages she'd jumbled in her humors. "No, Ned, we will not do that." Her eyes were wet as she smiled at him tearfully, exhaling through her now red nose. "We will tell them that for Rob, prior arrangements have been made, and in light of recent history we cannot be seen to be breaking these commitments. As for John, he has expressed his own wishes to just have a quiet life in the North with a quiet bride, and as he has no wish to cause any fervor for his brother's court, we have agreed to support him in this hope." A thick brown brow raised in skepticism at her words, as a begrudging smile finally softened her husband's face. "That works better than my refusal for Rob, yes, but we cannot expect them to believe a boy of barely 8 name-a-days made such a request." He scoffed this out, even as he peered into the gloomy night sky beyond the window. "Then we will say John is happiest with his chosen family, and it'd be best for the realm that he be allowed to be forgotten, a scandal best buried in the North." She bit back, her nerves fraying at his obstinance. "We've the solution to our problem, and he would rather stew in mislike and snit over wording than celebrate the solution. And we must officially make the offer to Lord Marndaley for his Winafid so as to not appear to be liars." She reminded him, her memory of that savage ritual and its ever-present inevitably in their lives a weight in her stomach. "Sansa as well, I imagine?" He grumbled with a huff, his brow dark with displeasure. "After our royal guests have left. We tell them that John will wed Sansa, they'll believe this is the North trying to put my nephew and my daughter on the Iron Throne. Too power-mad to believe that for some, the Iron Throne isn't the be-all and end-all." She laughed at that again, glad to finally have a firm understanding of their future and how they'd let their guests down. "Nay, husband." She chuckled, rising from her seat as she made to leave the room. "I helped you handle my grasping fellow Southrons. You alone must tell your savage Northmen that Sansa will not be wedding one of their proud sons. My part in this is done." The betrayed look on his face made her laugh all the harder as she swept into the hall. Asterisk 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 asterisk. Finale-ized Shorty made the ending days of the visit easier for both Ned and the boys, as Rob relented and thawed the wall of ice he'd erected around John and himself whenever their guests were present, and he allowed the bright and sweet soul he carried to shine through a bit more. He'd invited Brainer and the little princess to play with them at times, and even given Brainer a wooden sword with all the solemn comportment of a storied knight and his squire. The little princess got nothing from their son, but to see her she'd not appeared envious nor covetous, more concerned with looking askance at her friend with her wooden sword tucked into her sash and then to her steadfast knight who carried a mace on his belt. What she was given was a sculpture of a dragon in flight, 4 hands across and 2 wide, carved in that beautiful gut bowl wood that fetched high prices at the markets in the winter town and the stalls of Barrowton and White Harbour. The red flesh of the wood with the pitch-black swirls bleeding throughout and the gold flecks made the beast seem almost alive, and the black diamond eyes reflected the firelight of the hearth as the girl sat it in her lap, taking it everywhere she went once it was presented to her. Ned had balked at the thought of marring such a lovely wood to make a gift for a dragon princess, but when she reminded him that it'd be the best way to make such northern wares known to the realm, he acquiesced, if unhappily. His smile looked more like a grimace when first he saw the piece clutched possessively in her arms, but it gave way to a more genuine curl of his lips over the next few days, suspiciously aligning with their quickly approaching exit. It took a raven announcing that Benjen and the rest of the northern host was returning home after successfully aiding in the defeat of the Greyjoy rebellion for a true smile to find his lips for true. They were down to a sennight left of the royal visit when disaster finally struck, a childish spat running dangerously close to real offense. She'd been taking a needed respite with her daughters in her antechamber, Arya whining and wiggling for freedom from the soft cage of her mother's arms and Sansa showing her the uncommonly drawings she'd been making on the expensive parchment her father spoiled her with a platter of lemon cakes shared between them. Sansa was eating two for each one she and Arya had split, but who was counting, when the little piece of quiet was interrupted with the brisk knocks that signaled urgent need. She rose, plopping Arya on the seat next to her sister with a word to watch her and strode to the door. Coarse words more worthy of her Uncle Brynden than the Lady of Winterfell, but she did not care. Worrying over royal accommodations, soothing tempers over the unmistakable slight of the great northern lord's absence in the face of visiting royals, and just how much badwill would be gained from refusing betrothal offers from afar had her swinging the door open with more force than was needed, judging by the surprised yelp from Arya at the loud slam. Thurot, the guard on duty, looked the part of an anxious boy as he stammered through his apologies. But there was an emergency in the western yard, an argument between Lord Robb and the princess which drew into it her assigned protector, Sir Robel Reitker. She shouted for Nella the nurse for the children, and sure as the snow, she opened the nursery door that was just inside the family quarters, understanding without a word that she was needed to sit with the girls while Catelyn saw about her son. The plump Nari woman came with Bran nestled in her arms, half dozing with that customary stark frown that all her children slept with aside from perhaps Sansa. She moved past Catelyn with a nod and trooped into the room, exaggeratedly exclaiming at the mess of the lemon cake Arya was wearing on her face as Catelyn shut the door behind her, stealing her face as she looked to Thurot once again. "Stay here with my children and do not move until myself or Lord Stark come and tell you otherwise," she ordered coolly, her blue eyes locked on his brown ones. "I will send additional guards to join you and they will cover any entry into these quarters, understood?" She finished, not even blinking until he nodded in assent. That settled, she started a swift walk, her feet wanting to run but understanding she could not be seen to be panicked, as that would just add oil to whatever embers may have been kicked up by child's play. On her way through the suddenly entirely too large twists and turns of Winterfell she was met by a band of nearly 10 guardsmen, all familiar faces that announced they'd been sent by Sir Roderick to guard the Lord's family quarters. She thanked the 7 for the quick thinking of the master-at-arms and hurried her steps, still not running but faster than she had been, but still somehow not fast enough for her heart. She heard the row before she actually saw it, nearly slipping on snow-slick stone as she cleared the doorway to the yard, only for the strong dusky hand of one of the guardsmen who accompanied Prince Oberyn North to catch her about the elbow and help her steady herself. Her thanks hurried as she was already twisting around, looking for Ned, because it was his infuriated growl that she'd heard. The Martell Prince was there against the wall, hugging the Dane girl into his chest, ringed by his retinue and watching the proceedings with an interested eye, whispering something to one of his men who ran off in the other direction. She saw the Mandaeli girls watching with their hands touching, small faces wary and hard. When she caught the elder girl's eyes, she smiled, hopefully allaying any fears with the poise of an adult with everything under control. She found her husband and son with a captive audience nearest to the darkened hollow that led to the Godswood, her husband protectively stanced before Robb and Jon with Sir Menlik at his side, arrayed against the crimson and black-plated men of House Targaryen, and between the two sides was a small princess and her protector, Sir Robel, who fingered the handle of his mace lightly as the guardsmen of Winterfell slowly circled the walk with Sir Roderick at the center. She made to push through the throng to her son, but Ned's eyes caught hers and he gave the smallest of head shakes, nearly imperceptible but for those who know him. "Lord Stark, this is unseemly," Sir Robel said easily, as if he were complaining about the price of a bag of flour in a market. "We are guests that have accepted your bread and salt, and for you to flank us with steel, our very own princess of the blood in the midst, is skirting a line I thought we'd left behind, nearly a decade ago." He snorted then, the sound amplified by the white steel helmet he wore as he slightly shifted to face Sir Menlik. "And you, sir, have clearly lost your senses in this wasteland of snow and heathenism. You'd set yourself against your brother of the White Order. For what? A bastard and a wolf pup. Mayhap Prince Viserys was correct to tell the princess mother that you were not to be trusted." He spat then, his flagrant disrespect landing in the too small space between the two groups, his action putting Robb to scowling like his father was. This was ridiculous. She started shoving her way to her family, ignoring Ned's glare as Sir Roderick moved with her, using his bulk to assist her in clearing a path, his guards stepping into the wedge behind them, splintering the dragon-cloaked men-at-arms with their burly forms. "Ned!" she shouted as she broke through the open space. Ignoring the Crownland Knight and the princess, he stood over as she marched up to her husband, taking Rob's face into her hands and looking him over, bruises and scrapes her concern. "What has happened here, Rob?" "John?" she demanded fearfully, looking him over next and leaning over to brush a kiss on his forehead, ignoring the blush that pinked his cheeks. "Nothing, Aunt Caitlin," he murmured, clearly scared at the obvious tensions that were alight around them. "Rob and I were playing with the princess and Brainer, and then we wanted to show Brainer the heart tree, but it's only for Starks, so we told Daenerys to wait while we went. We were coming back, I promise," he stammered out, his grey eyes wet with frustration and the need to be believed. Of course. The little girl she'd willed herself not to feel shamed by was somehow involved. Brandon's daughter, who looked more like Arya than Sansa, her own sister, did. Ned was only too pleased by the revelation that a piece of his brother was still living, and so made sure she knew she would always be welcome in Winterfell, with her mother beside her. He was probably hoping to have her undergo the same heathen rituals he'd subjected their own children to. Would the Dornish woman allow it? Or was she more her mother's daughter than her father's? The all-too-lovely Lady Ashura, who walked around Winterfell with sad and longing eyes. Was it those mysterious purple eyes that pulled Brandon away from his honor and into her bed? Did it even matter, these many years later and with the happiness she and Ned had found together? She was pulled back from her silly rumination on newly found hurts by the bullying manner of an anointed knight aimed squarely at her son and his cousin. "And who are you to tell the princess she must wait?" Sir Robel glowered at both boys, a heavy chill in his words as he eyed them. "It's not for you to tell her where she can and cannot go. Everything you have is at the leisure and will of House Targaryen. She is the blood of the dragon, she's not to wait without as if she were not worthy. And yet, that is in fact what she must do." Ned Stark had pulled her behind him, so she pulled Rob into her embrace, laying her arms across his shoulders that were tight with dislike at the moment. "We in the North treat our guests with respect and at the same time expect our guests to treat us with that same dignity in return." He bit out through angry teeth, his arm like iron where she leaned against it. "The Godswood and the Crypts are two places that are only for those of Stark blood, and it has been this way for several millennia. Just as her brother was removed from Winterfell for his refusal to understand this, the lesson can be repeated," he promised, his words heavy with intent. There was an audible bristle that carried through the Targaryen men-at-arms at her husband's cool words, a hardening around the eyes that had her counting the men Roderick had brought with him and not being reassured at their number. Sir Menlik spoke up then, his massive form dwarfing all around him, even Ned by several inches. "I have been in the North for nearly a year, sir, and never once have I sought to intrude on the sacred places of House Stark. And yet my charge is fine, and all has been well," he stated softly, the rumbling voice calm and smooth. Lord Rob may have been a tad abrasive in his refusal to allow the princess to join them, but such is the way of children. No harm has been done, let us not have the peace of this visit be ruined by a children's spat. Sir Robel scoffed once more and muttered something she suspected was most crass under his breath, a word unfit for ears noble or royal, seeing how the little princess's eyes went wide in shock. "I must ask Lord Stark, would you be so bold as to deny my son entry into your Godswood, should Rhaegar be here in all his kingly right, or is it just easier for you to turn away little girls?" Rhaegar Targaryen had arrived and came with her fangs out and glistening, her men smoothly parting at her approach, allowing her to glide to the fore, pulling her daughter into the circle of her arms in a tender motion that spoke to the love she held for her youngest. Her young Fossaway knight was silent at her back, his hand tight around the hilt of his sword. At the side of the crowd where the Martell men were, Lady Ashura pulled her only child to her body, kneeling to kiss her cheeks and wipe away the tears that marked them. At the mention of his deceased good brother Prince Oberyn looked away from the two, his brows pulled down in a frown. Old wounds and scars still ache. Eddard Stark wasn't a man given to swift, rash anger. His temper was more slowly born, rising by inches and feeding into itself, as his eyes turned glacial and his words sharpened. He didn't storm or shout, he merely loomed, until it was just coldly boiling wrath caught behind his gaze, threatening to spill out but for his infamous self-control, that iciness that made many think his veins bore ice, not blood. That ice revealed itself then, so clearly that her son pushed himself closer to her in worry. I would with much pleasure tell your son that our God's wood is not for those who are not Starks. He said softly, the contempt he held for her dead son oozing through his words. It is a sacred place, where our gods dwell, and I fear them more than any who might wear a crown, no matter who it may be. I suspect things may have been much better in the realm if some understood that the world in fact did not exist solely for their pleasure and perusal. The unwelcome sound of a sword sliding from a scabbard punctuated her husband's words, his insolence in truth. That sounds dangerously close to treason, Lord Stark. Sir Castan was the youngest of the Kingsguard, and he proved it by being the one foolish enough to bear steel where words would have worked better. His one blade was soon outmatched by the many of the northern Winterfell guardsmen who unsheathed in response the purple eyes of the princess wide from the safety of her mother's arms. "Sheathe your steel!" Ned bellowed, his eyes livid at the temerity of them all. "You as well, Ser. This is my castle, and you would risk breaking guest right. In front of my lady wife and son. My nephew. To posture about a dead fool." He marched up to the smaller reachman, brushing aside the Dowager Queen to grab the man by his breastplate. "Put up your sword before I break it over my knee and then do the same to you." The men of Winterfell obeyed their lord instantly but kept their hands on hilts, eyes watchful and distrustful of their formerly tolerated guests. The young knight stubbornly kept his blade drawn but pointed at the cold ground, a battle between the realization of his error and the drumming his pride took at being handled thusly playing out on his face, until his charge forfeited the field for him. "You don't command me, Stark," he asserted, all boyish anger and bluster. "I am Kingsguard, you savage. Try my steed. Sheath your sword, sir," was all the Dowager Queen snapped at him before she turned back to face the Lord of the North, her eyes flashing with anger. "That dead fool was my son, and your rightful King Lord Stark," she declared, her words underpinned by hurt and grief that made itself clear on the way her voice caught at the end. "The father of the nephew you proclaim to love and cherish." Her newly wet eyes fell on him then, pressing into the other side of Catelyn, hiding his face in her skirt. "He made mistakes, yes, costly mistakes, but even if you cannot accept the choices he made, you should respect that connection. If not for his sake, then for someone else's." Her eyes directly met Catelyn's then, and then dropped back to the boy holding her skirts, the message clear. Pulling her daughter with her, the Dowager Queen of the Seven Kingdoms turned and made to march away, only slowing when her daughter turned and held out her hand. Braina Dane took it gladly and the two ran off together, the armored form of Sir Robel fast on their heels and Queen Rulla not far behind with Lady Dane at her side. Sir Castan threw a withering glare at Ned and then followed, hurrying his steps to shorten the distance to the Dowager. Ned pulled her and the boys into his arms, murmuring comfort to the small ones and tender kisses to her brow. Over her head, she heard him give heartfelt thanks to Sir Menlik for standing at his side, even against his brother in white. Prince Oberyn Martell had the worst timing, or mayhap best depending on if he sought to always instigate trouble. This is why I will never understand the truly pious. All religion ever seems to do is divide people. She breathed a laugh into Ned's leather doublet, half wanting to strangle the Dornish prince and half wanting to agree with him. It was into this easy air, this release of pressure in the light of an avoidance of violence that shouts came from the main courtyard and the hailing of someone pulled her head from her husband's shoulder. Lord Benjen Stark cantered into the courtyard on a tired horse, with a more tired smile beneath tired eyes, but he was a welcome sight, a break in cloudy skies allowing the sun to light on Winterfell. He had a long tail of men with him, some of the younger soldiers of Winterfell and Lord Willam Dustin and Lord Jorah Mormont at the front, all dusty but alive and grinning. The boys broke from the Ned's side and ran to their uncle, joyful whoops and questions firing like arrows at him as he clambered down from the lathered horse, Hodder the giant stable boy already at his side taking the reins with a word of thanks from the younger Stark son. Fin. Chapter 14. Summary. Been a fight to get this one out. Enjoy. Chapter text. Chapter 14. Winterfell, the North 292. Jon. Robb was angry. His cousin was angry all the time, it seemed. And his anger made him noisy. He was angry at all the unfamiliar faces with their weird accents walking around Winterfell. He was angry at the crowded training yard, at the brown faces scornful of their drills and spars. He was angry at the different new spices in the foods at supper, the meats that burned his throat and the breads that were pungent and chewy. He was angry that the golden threads were brighter, almost buzzing with energy from all the new people in the home of the Starks, but they still couldn't understand just what they were. He was angry that they weren't allowed to play in the Godswood while southern guests were in the castle. When their Uncle Benjamin explained it was safer for Trickle that way, it helped but not much. Old Nan said it was like the time the chicken fold of a nearby farm was left open, and people were stepping over squawking birds from the castle all the way to the King's Road for days. Rob didn't seem to care about any stupid chickens, but he did care that his home didn't feel like home. He was angry that Winterfell did not feel like Winterfell anymore. And John was scared that deep down part of Rob was angry at the reason why so many people had come to Winterfell. Him. The little stupid dog boy. Rob promised he wasn't mad at John, just annoyed by his sad grandmother and his bratty aunt, but John just saw that small wrinkle across his brow that seemed deeper and deeper each day and wondered. He took that frown everywhere, from lessons with the maester doing sums and sigils, to even their matches in the practice yard, his motions whip fast and his feet light. But his rhythm was loud, like a hammer pounding against John's ears. A booming sound that told John when Rob was waiting and when he was moving before he himself even knew. All of Winterfell was loud these days, between so many people and then the noise of all their rhythms. It felt like his ears had grown as large as those on that elephant animal Maester Lewin had shown them from one of his books. Even now, as he sparred against Rob, he could hear his thumping patterns, even louder than the scuff of his boots against the ground or the rasp of his padded armor against his body. Rob had been much better than John from the first time Sir Roderick had offered him his own wooden sword, never cruel or mean about it, but still, much better than him. But ever since that frown got comfortable on his face, Rob's thrums had become so loud it was like he became one of the books the Maester was using to teach Sansa her letters, with the words so easy that a babe could read them. John could hear his patterns, and now he could almost see through them. The quickened boil that sounded like the noises from the busy Winterfell kitchens told him that Rob was ready to move, his feet only a second behind his thrums, the smooth wooden blade already whipping at his John, his own arm already up. Sir Roderick's voice in his memory telling him that his sword is an extension of his arm, a small shield used against whoever is in front of him. He caught Rob's swing and then he silently breathed out, his ears already listening for the telling thrums that told him when to stand or when to give. The rhythms pulled at him, telling him Rob was pushing ahead, so he gave the space up, a second before Rob pushed, so when he did and Rob stumbled, John was already inside his space and swatting at his padded right side. The frown only got deeper as Rob steadied himself, the shouted corrective encouragement from Sir Roderick only making his lips tighten as he glared at the training sword in his hands as if it betrayed him. He was on John less than a second later, his eyes narrowed into a thin blue streak as he closed on John. The oak bills in their hands were clattering against each other as quickly as they could, Rob's inner patterns telling John more the longer they clashed, the louder they rang out, until he could almost see them surrounding Rob and then leaking forward, screaming at John which way he was going to come from. Only angry people gave so much of themselves away, their patterns noisy against the walls of the castle like hands slapping on tables. His grandmother was angry, and her thrums were loudest whenever she was in the great hall and Uncle Ned was sitting with his children around him. Her thrums then beat like giants' fists on wooden benches, the way Hoddus did when he stretched and knocked his hands on the lower beams of the stables. Aunt Caitlin wasn't angry like his grandmother or Rob, but her patterns did get louder when Lady Dane entered the room. They got almost shrill when Uncle Ned spoke to Lady Dane in the great hall, but they never stayed that high for long. Rob, Arya or Sansa, or some business with the steward were almost always able to send her thrums back to their quiet steady patters. Uncle Ned was like standing next to the smithy, his beats so loud and ringing that you could hear him coming. The only time he was quiet enough to be able to stand next to was in the morning, when he looked in on them in their room. And Rob was worse than them all. His thrums were like a hound's growls, curling around his eyes whenever someone who he felt didn't belong crossed his path. Which was often these days. So it meant that where Rob had always beaten John in spars before the royal visit, John was easily coming out ahead in their matches now, a game John played against himself, stretching his ability to dance between the thrums, finding fun in the close catches against Rob's slashes and swings. He'd even heard whiskery Sir Roderick muttering to himself about him being a daredevil just like his late mother was as a child. A daredevil. That small connection to his mother lifted his heart so much that he still wore a smile on his face that didn't waver even after Sir Roderick informed Rob that his Lord Father had summoned all three of them to his solar after their drills were finished and their equipment racked. Rob just stomped through the halls, the passing servants and guests looking at the pinched face of his cousin with that know-it-all humor that only adults seem to have. John just hurried his steps to keep pace with him, his own thoughts worried about what they'd done now, Sir Roderick and Sir Menlik a wall of man at their backs. They hadn't tried to sneak into the Godswood, nor had they complained about the funny-tasting foods at their meals. They hadn't even bickered with Rob's sisters or Daenerys and Braina. Even though his aunt looked silly carrying that big dragon everywhere with her, both he and Rob had said nothing. "Here we are, lads," Sir Roderick announced once they'd reached Lord Stark's solar, the two guards at their post nodding above their heads to the captain of the guard. Sir Menlik took up his position across from them, his large form causing the tallow candles to blink briefly. Opening the door, Sir Roderick granted them inside, his own heavy feet following them in. They both shared one giant chair, large enough for Sir Menlik to sit in while Sir Roderick took the other free chair. Behind the massive wooden desk, sat his uncle, Lord Stark with his face leaning over the papers in front of him. Beyond that desk, against the wall and resting on a tapestry that showed wolves howling in front of a grey castle leaned the sword ice. Rob had told him once that his father only takes it out when there's a need for justice, but he'd never seen the actual blade himself. Only that his father told him what his father had told him and his siblings as a boy. Justice is heavy. Rob told him he thought that the blade is probably white, to go along with the grey hilt. It's got to be in the colors of the house, right? They'd asked Sir Menlik that, and he'd laughed until he wheezed, begging off from their additional questions and just saying they'd have to ask Lord Stark about it. They'd forgotten to though, so many other things sprouting up, so many adventures needing to played out. Lord Stark looked like he'd been on several adventures these days, his eyes tired like a hound. Everyone who came to Winterfell remarked on how like his Uncle John looked, but these days, the look he wore gave off the same impression as the frown Rob carried everywhere. They were angry. "Sir Roderick, it happened again?" his uncle asked, that thick northern accent making him sound even more worn out than he looked. "Yes, Lord Stark," the old knight said quickly, his leathers squeaking as he nodded with his words. Out of 3 matches, John here had 4 points to each one of Rob's. Over his uncle's wide shoulders, John saw one of the golden light veins insistently dancing by the cluttered bookshelf against the wall, the weak sunlight that angled through the thin window dim next to the beautiful golden cord. They were all over Winterfell these days, shining against walls and doors. It was like being in the Godswood at midday, and seeing the sunlight drifting through the trees but everywhere. Sometimes they gathered around certain people, curling upon their heads like little circlets, just like the ones they had sometimes made Egon and Rhaenys wear in the Red Keep, for balls and feasts. Never John though. When he'd asked why he never worn one, Lord Connington had looked thunderstruck, as if John had broken wind on his trencher. Old Nan often had several resting on her head and shoulders, and on those days, she seemed to move a little bit faster, her steps surer and her stoop not so pronounced. Sir Roderick had 1 or 2 always dangling from his funny beard, 1 on each side. Even Braina, their Dornish guest who looked a little bit like Arya, had 1 constant golden cord, always dangling from the top of her head to reach down to her feet. Sometimes she had another 1 curling about her shoulders, but mostly it was just that 1 lonely wisp of gold. Lady Catelyn and Arya often had strands draped over them, Arya especially when she was being a bother. It's like they like her bratty. But Sansa had the most by far. Just looking at her sometimes she'd look like she was part of the sun, just yellow shining tendrils that fell from her head to her feet. She'd glow if they gave off real light, Rob japed to him once. Rob had plenty all over his body, he always had at least 5 filaments of gold draped over him. Bran wore the most after Sansa, his looking almost like a glowing cape that followed him whenever he crawled on the floor. John was often bare of them as far as he could see, but Rob swore that there was always at least 1 curled upon his head. He didn't care anyways. They weren't real, you couldn't touch them or pull them off. They were just a strange bit of magic that Winterfell held within it, which he shouldn't have allowed to distract him from the conversation, his uncle and Rob both looking at him. Lord Stark cleared his throat and spoke again, his bandaged hand lightly drumming on the table he sat behind. "John, have you been practicing your drills by yourself?" His uncle asked gently, his eyes curious. "You'll not get in trouble?" He squirmed in his chair, looking at the large hand that now mirrored his own, their shortened small fingers. He couldn't tell them about the veins. He couldn't tell them about the thrums either. Between themselves, he and Rob had agreed to say nothing about the strange new things they saw or heard. The adults wouldn't believe them. Would say it's just children's silliness and games. "I'm not practicing alone, uncle, I promise," he swore, ignoring the angry thrumming that Rob was giving off. "Rob is just so angry now, and angry people make mistakes. That's what Sir Roderick told us, and all I do is wait for him to step too slow or swing too far." The thrums were vibrating around Rob then, to the point that John wondered if Lord Stark could feel them as well by the way his eyes widened as he moved his eyes to Rob. Between throbs he could almost hear the word. "Traitor! Traitor! Traitor!" It was like he was back in the Red Keep again, and the one time he got sick of being the one who got pinched and shoved. Rhaenys and her cousins had just played another trick on John, leaving him stuck in a secret passage running with rats and spiders, each squeak and feather-like tickle causing him to jump as he felt for the switch to open the hidden door. 5 agonizing minutes later he was out from the gloom and angrily pinching Rhaenys on the arm amid her tinkling laughter, and the glare he received in turn from Prince Luwin froze the air in his chest. "It's a poor dog that bites the hand that feeds it," was all the grey-haired man said before ushering his charge and her cousins away from him. "A stupid dog boy who bites the wrong hands." He looked away from his uncle, dropping his eyes and peering at Rob to his left, seeing his fists clenched on his breeches and his foot bouncing. "Son," started Lord Stark before Rob cut him off in an explosion of movement, his chair sliding back a couple spaces from the force of his standing. John gaped at him, his mouth falling open in shock. "I'm not angry," Rob hissed, his face flushed nearly as red as his hair. "I just want Winterfell to go back to how it was before they showed up." He flopped back into his chair then, his arms folded across his belly with a pout that reminded John strongly of Sansa when she fell into one of her rare tantrums. His lord uncle's frown was fearsome then, his displeasure at his son's rudeness plain in the way his eyes turned flinty in the gloomy room. "John, the Dowager Queen has expressed to me that she has something she'd like to share with you in your chambers this afternoon. You will go there and accept whatever she has for you, because she is your grandmother and has come a long way to see you. Hiding away with your cousin during her visit except for meals is no way to treat your blood." He said these words to John, but his eyes were on Rob, who still had his arms crossed over his chest. "And I will need to see to my heir. Alone." Sir Roderick was already standing and bowing to his lord, his whiskers dancing as he bent low. John mimicked his movements, his eyes falling to Rob one last time as he squirmed in the chair in front of his father. His uncle acknowledged their exit with a cool nod even as his eyes never left his son's. John nodded his head at the Master-at-Arms and Sir Menlik who waited and made to begin the slow walk to the chambers he and Rob shared when a familiar snort at his side slowed him. Sir Roderick had paused in the hall outside as the door closed behind them and he looked at John for a long moment before he slowly lifted his arm and placed a heavy hand on John's shoulder. "You understand that we're not displeased that you've improved in your lessons, lad?" The old knight rumbled, his dark eyes shining from the ruddy pits of his craggy face. "We've all seen the differences in Lord Rob, and there was just some concern about from where it sprang. It was brave of you to speak so plainly, even if you feared his reaction. But he's a good lad like you, and there'll be no hard feelings. Now be off to see your gran," he ordered with a huff, his gruffness betrayed by the small smile on his lips. His tongue felt thick and stiff in his mouth, wedged up against his gums, and all he could do was nod, the older man's words partially loosening the stone of worry that had nestled in his belly since he'd first blurted out that Rob was angry. The older man squeezed the slope his hand rested on for emphasis and turned and strode away down the hall, his heavy boots thudding on the stone in a dwindling tempo the further away he got. His own walk to his chamber was a slow dawdling thing, and he felt like the stranded duckling they'd found on one of their chaperoned rides around the grounds of Winterfell. All the way, his thoughts were of all the times she'd asked for him back when she'd come from Dragonstone to visit the capital, and how stilted and painful those infrequent interactions were. She'd ask him how he'd liked his lessons and if he'd made any friends yet. When he said yes, he enjoyed his lessons but he had not made any friends, she'd wilt and try and comfort him. With her pitiful pats and mumbled words, she'd always promise that things would get better soon enough. And then she'd go still and white, then take herself off, muttering more apologies to him and the room and shut herself away. Which would then have his uncle seeking him out, hissing threats and promises of pain if the bastard kept making his queen mother sad. And Rhaenys and Aegon would glare at him at meals later, as if it was his fault that the sad old lady was once again sad. And through it all, Princess Mother Elia would just look at him, her mouth speaking politely to any at her side, but her dark eyes were forever moving around the room but always returning to him somehow. He wasn't aware he'd covered the distance to his assigned destination until he heard the terse acknowledgement that Sir Castan gave to Sir Menlik at his back as the knights arrayed themselves across from each other. Sir Menlik was much more polite as he returned the greeting, his words as steady as the hand he put on Jon's back to usher him into the room. Inside he found his grandmother standing in the center of the room, an awkwardness in the way she looked between the two beds in the room, both ironwood fixtures neatly laid with furs and pillows. Robs had the direwolf of House Stark everywhere, engraved renders of the mythical animal on the head and foot, and a banner of his house hung across the wall above it, so he might see the crest last when he closed his eyes at night and first opened them in the morning. Jon's bed had been added to the heir's chamber not too long after Jon had arrived, his own original chamber in the family wing a bit further from that of the Lord and his immediate family. It was after Robb had somehow thawed the ice around Jon's heart that he'd insisted that he and Jon should share a room together. Lady Stark had balked and Lord Stark had pondered, but Robb was adamant that it would be for the best, to help him get used to the north. In the months since they'd relented and allowed it, it seemed to Jon the real challenge had been to get used to Robb's snores. In sleep he snuffled like a bear with a bellyful of honey, his Uncle Benjen liked to say. His own bed faced Robb's from across the room, an equal distance from the large hearth that dominated the furthest wall, that allowed both boys to enjoy the toasty warmth on chilly nights. But absent the running wolves that decorated his cousin's bed, his was decorated with carvings of a rose that his Uncle Ned had told him were his mother's favorite, the blue winter rose that only grew in the north. Only the foot of his bed had a carving of a direwolf, and even there it was surrounded by the loose petals of his mother's favorite bloom. Dowager Queen Rolla Targaryen had been looking at his bed from the center of the room when he stepped inside, her eyes fixed on his things but too far away to touch them the way it seemed she would have liked. Her hands were at her sides, but they swayed slightly with dancing fingers, the same way Viserys did whenever Aegon had received a particularly interesting gift for his name-a-day or just because he was king. "My lady grandmother," was all he said as he walked further into the room, his hands clasped nervously in front of him. Looking away from his bed, she turned to him with a watery smile on her face, her purple eyes soft on her face. "Jaehaerys," she breathed out, extending a hand towards him. Hearing that, he couldn't help but wince. "Forgive me." She pulled that same hand back, mirroring his own in a heavily ringed clasp. "You prefer Jon?" His feet were suddenly rather interesting, it seemed, because he couldn't look at her. "Jaehaerys or Jon is fine, Your Grace. Both are good to me." He lied, his ears stuffed with memories of sneers about how a dog boy could have such a name. The courtiers had no shortage of thoughts on a bastard son of a northern tart bearing such a vaunted name. To dare and link one such as he with the conciliator himself was the highest insult to the blood of the dragon. Her black skirts swished into his view even as a hot hand cupped his chin and lifted his eyes from the floor to meet her shining gaze. "No, Jon," she stated softly, a fragile smile taking years from her face. "You prefer to be called Jon and so I will call you Jon. T's a good name for a strong boy," she offered, even as she released his chin to pull one of his hands into her own. He allowed her to pull him to his bed and sat down beside her, still clasping his hand within the grip of her own. "You did not want any dragons for your bed, Jon?" she asked, her free hand tracing the petal-shaped impressions in the night-dark wood of his headboard. He felt like a pit opened in his belly at her words, a crack in the shield of the detachment from his southern family giving way to his old habits of silence and shrinking. "Jon," he heard again, before he realized he was crying, silent tears falling onto their clasped hands in his lap as he apologized repeatedly, his words choking as he stumbled over old hurts and rejections. She pulled him close then, the first real hug he can remember her ever giving him, and it was wonderful to feel the warmth of her body and the strength of her arms as she held him tightly to her. "Jon, it's all right." She breathed into his hair as she held his head to her neck. I'll not stop loving you over a bed, nor over your chosen name. You are marrow of mine, and there is very little you could do to make me truly unhappy. She patted his shoulder then, her hands real and warm, and then pushed him back from her so she could look him in the eye. John, I know that we as a family have failed you in so many ways, she said, her eyes wet above her sad smile. From the adults, it was more a sacrifice to politics to which you were abandoned. From me, my failures as a mother scared me into inaction. I could have and should have done more to make you feel more welcome in our family. I should have fought for you, the way I wish I fought for your father. Her words here were heavy, so seldom did his father mention that it was always something of a shock to hear him spoken of. My tiredness was no excuse for what I left you to, so I have no right to come here to this place of happiness for you and ask you to beloved that which hurt you and kept you in the cold. That's not fair of me. And you are happy here, John? Her hand found his again, and she rubbed her thumb across his knuckles as he thought on her question. Rob. Arya. Sansa. Uncle Ned. Uncle Benjen. Aunt Caitlin. Bran. The Godswood. Trickle. Old Nan. Sir Roderick. Hodder. Home. All he could do was pull her into another real hug, and when her arms pulled him in tight, he whispered yes into her ear. She wept then, her hands fisted in the back of his tunic as she made his nape wet with her tears. He just rubbed his hands on her back the way Aunt Caitlin did to them when they were crying, and kept doing so until her own stopped. She sat back then, wiping her nose on her sleeve the way Arya did, and then gave a sad laugh as she cupped his face in her soft hands. Well, I always promised you that things would get better, did I not? She chuckled at that, but her lips twisted to the side, and her chin quivered the way Sansa's did whenever her mother told her to let Arya play with one of her toys. Things are better, my lady grandmother, he said softly, his head turning across the room to the bed where Rob would lie later that night. Rob and I have lessons together, and drill in the yard as well. And Sansa makes us play knights and maidens with her and Arya, though Arya just wants to be the horse more than a maiden. And then we play in the Godswood, and old Nan tells us stories and gives us warm cider with lemon cakes to eat while she tells them, and Uncle Ned sometimes gives Rob and I both lessons on ruling, and the north is so big and it's not as crowded and smelly as the capital, and next year Uncle Ned said we might be old enough to get our own ponies, and... His grandmother's hand went up, her own eyes bright as she listened to him babble on, a fond smile for true on her face as she beheld his animated joy. John, we have another Senate here, so we will have more time for you to share what adventures you've experienced in the north later, but I wanted you here so I could give you a gift that I think you should have, but first, I need to know what happened here 3 moons ago. We received letters from Sir Menlik saying that you and your cousin had been maimed and were under strict guard. Her eyes were hard, even as she took his hand and turned him to face her fully. That stone was back in his stomach, and it was rolling back and forth as she looked at him expectantly. He pulled his free hand to his lap and turned it over, showing the 4 fingers and the nub that Maestelowin called the proximal phalanx that was left of his little finger. She gasped at that, pulling the hand she'd held up to see the disfigurement mirrored in that hand as well. John. She stood then, her face whiter than the bark of the heart tree as she looked aghast at his hands. Outside the door, Sir Costain could be heard knocking in askance at her volume. "We're fine, Ser," she shouted, her eyes still fixed on his hands. "John, what happened?" Her volume was much lower then, but her eyes were flat with horror. "Magic, grandmother." She blanched then, her hands fisting in her black skirts as she paced before him. Then she fell to her knees beside him, pulling his hands into her own and kissing the palms before she pulled him closer. "Magic isn't real, John," she declared, her eyes imploring him to believe her. "It was at one time, yes, but when the last dragons died, so did magic die with them. To chase magic and sorcery is a fool's errand, and dangerous besides. Our family has suffered too much because of faith and obsession with mysticism, and I'll not see you consumed as the rest of our family was. Beyond that, Lord Stark loves you, I see it, and so does anyone else with eyes, but if you insist on bringing magic into his halls, he will turn you out. Northmen aren't ones for such fixations, and I'd not see you lose this happiness when you've just found it." She kissed his forehead then, her breath teasing his hair. He pulled back then, the unfairness of it causing him to clench his hands. Rob had said nobody would believe them, but if it meant he'd be dragged back to the Red Keep if he stayed quiet, he'd sing like those birds' songs are like to draw on her parchment. Magic is real, he insisted, his scowl matching her own. If magic wasn't real, how come Rob and I can see the gold strands that no one else can? We can hear better than anyone else, better than the hounds in the kennels and the cats in the kitchens. We can even hear the thrums that everyone else can't. He leaned even closer to her then and decided to go for it. And if magic isn't real, what's this? He demanded before he stuck out his tongue. Her purple eyes boggled at his audacious display, before they focused on his mouth and what he knew she was seeing. In the middle of his healthy pink tongue, was a white imprint that was a perfect match for a weirwood leaf. Rob had first discovered it, when John did better in a lesson on sums and stuck out his tongue at him in return for the funny face Rob shot at him, while Maester Lewin praised John and admonished Rob to study more. His shocked face caused John to break out into laughter, and Lewin ended up chiding him too, and it was only after they were released that Rob pulled John into their room and told him what he'd seen. Rob had extended his own and found a matching mark, and both had promised to not tell or show anyone until they could show Trickle and ask her what it meant. And John had broken that promise now. John, his grandmother was breathing hard, her face aghast. What is that? He kicked his feet and looked at the floor, his earlier bravery leaving him. Magic, he whispered. John, magic isn't real. She was getting louder again, her eyes flashing whenever she looked at him. Whatever this is, it isn't magic. He stood then, his eyes meeting hers even though he stood no closer to her. Magic is real. Valyrian magic might have died with the dragons, but the magic of the first men and the children of the forest are much older than Valyria, and their magic is still around. Maester Lewin says so. He finished, his arms crossed over his chest. Oh, because Maester Lewin says. She scoffed, her tone reminding him of Rhaenys for some reason. Yes, that must mean magic is real. If magic is real, prove it to me, John. Prove to me in one way that magic is real, and I'll not write a letter to Princess Elia this very evening. The room was silent for a long while, two people linked by blood glaring at one another before vitality gave in before age. You don't like my uncle, Lord Stark. You really don't like it when you see him with Lady Stark and my cousins. Your thrums are so loud whenever you see them all together that it's like a giant beating a hammer. She went still at those words, her face draining of any remaining color as he sat back down on the bed, feeling ashamed of himself for some reason. She was in a daze it seemed, for she went to her knees and pulled a long package from under the bed, then upon reaching her feet she pulled him close and kissed his head and rasped that it was a piece of his history and meant for him to have. She then staggered from the room, her gait unsteady and her lips pinched inward. And he heard the words of the Martell Prince ringing in his head again. It's a poor dog that bites the hand that feeds it. Asterisk 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 asterisk. Eddard Stark. He felt a proper fool once his master-at-arms and his nephew left him alone with his nephew in his suddenly overly large solar. His firstborn son, his head stretched in a perfectly petulant slouch in the massive chair across from him, swallowed both by the chair's leather and the heavy silence that sat on the room, his usually brave boy determinedly looking everywhere and at everything in the room but him. John was right. Rob was angrier this past moon than he'd ever seen a boy of his age. Even in his memories of Robert from their youth, the boy from the Stormlands flared bright and fast like a hungry fire, but he was even quicker to die out, the noise and fury giving way soon enough to his more famous affability and charisma. Rob, though, had simmered and nurtured his anger, that wrinkle in his small brow more like his grandfather Ricard's whenever Brandon's wildness presented yet another problem he had to solve from across this very desk before him. Going by how long it had went unnoticed by both Caitlin and himself, it might become as engraved in his son as it had in his grandsee. Rob had his mother's southern coloring, but he tended his anger and oughts like the quintessential Northman, slowly and steadily feeding it and making sure it stayed alive, even when one would have been better served releasing it before it consumed them. My lady mother once told me that anger is first wed to fear, before anything else. His son's blue eyes met his momentarily at his words, before continuing their pattern of intentional avoidance around the room. That when we allow anger to rule us, it's fear in truth that we've bowed to, and anger is the sop we lean on to avoid admitting that in truth, we are afraid and it has unmanned us. His words received no response from his son, aside from an uptick in the swinging feet at the base of his slouched form. Fear is something we've all experienced, but we cannot let it rule us. So what has you so afraid, Rob? The feet kicking intensified, but still no words. So Ned just resumed his letter writing, remembering how his own father had used this very tactic to squeeze anxieties and worries from him and his siblings as children. He was halfway through a letter to Lord Carstock, for the third time directing him to increase his guild stipend for the Woodwise surveyors when he saw the swinging feet of his son still, and he offered the first words he'd said since the others had left them alone. "I'm not afraid," he muttered, some portion of his mother's look present in his tightened jaw. It's just that when the Queen Lady first came to here, you said Winterfell is hers. And then when the Princess's Knight said everything we have is at the will and leisure of House Targaryen, I asked Maester Lewin what leisure means and he said it means at someone else's command. Does that mean the king can order us out of Winterfell and give it to someone else? Where would we go then? His son's tully blue eyes were red around the rim, as if the tears were there but still dammed up by his pride of not wanting to seem a weeping babe before his father. How could I have missed this? The heavy fear and heavier anxiety that his son had been carrying on his small shoulders made Ned's heart clench with anger, not just at the over-proud fool of a knight, but at himself, for having been blinded to the weights his heir had carried in silence. Ned stood from his chair and strode around the table, taking the seat Jon had vacated and turned it to face his son, who looked away as he sought to discreetly wipe his eyes, away from his father's sight. Stretching forth his hand, he cupped the soft red locks of the crown of his boy's head and pulled him close, tucking that small russet head into his shoulder. "My brave boy," he whispered, unashamed at the small catch in his own voice. "No one is going to turn us out of Winterfell. We Starks have held Winterfell and the North for thousands of years, going back several millennia. Before there were Targaryens, there were Starks and they were of Winterfell. We've held the North against the Andal hordes, we've broken countless Ironborn reavers, and we've wiped out slavers from the east. We've broken more wilderling hosts than the Godswood has branches, and almost 8 years past, we nearly broke the dragons as well. Many have sought to take Winterfell and the North itself from us, yet we are still here, and strong. Pay no attention to the threats of that night. Small men tend to make large claims, and great men are there to disprove them. We are going nowhere. I hold Winterfell and the North, the same way my father held it, and his before him. As you will after me." He spoke this promise to his blood, knowing the truth of it deep inside. He hugged his son then, inhaling the slight familial scent that clung to the top of his head even as he held the stiff body against him. His mind's eye could see Rob as a man, his frame long and rangy, that red hair long and bright against the stark colors of the North. His tully coloring but his stark frame and manner, a beloved son and treasured brother and honored lord. He saw his siblings beside him, Sansa tall and stately, her mother's shade but with more wolf to her face. Arya was the mirror of his dead sister, but wiser and sadder because of it. Bran was there, his face a shadow but his frame was slim like Benjen. But somehow Ned knew he would laugh like his namesake, wholeheartedly and unreserved. Jon was at the side of Rob, watchful, in the way his grandfather Ricard had been. There was space for another, but he couldn't see who it was, man or woman. But even with that absence, there was a wholeness there that the gods gifted him to see, as he breathed in that childlike fragrance that clung to children. But what if the king orders us out? Can't he send armies to invade us and take over the North? His son's fears were a Duggan thing, and the way they wrapped around his heart must have mirrored the way his small hands gripped his father's jerkin. I asked Mayor Stillowin and he said that the Reach can field the largest army in the realm. What if the king orders Lord Tyrell to take the north? Robb asked, the leather fabric hiding his face. Lord Tyrell cannot attack the north without leaving his own lands vulnerable to both the Stormlands and the Riverlands, my son. Ned assured him, his hand rubbing circles on the small back. That is why we have allies. They have pledged to come to our aid, just as we have pledged to come to theirs. We are strong because the north is strong, and we're even stronger because we do not stand alone. Your mother is the daughter of the Lord of the Riverlands, remember. You think your Lord Grandfather who sends you such nice name-a-day gifts would stand aside while your mother and you and your siblings were threatened? He jostled him as he asked that last question, smiling into his crown as the boy grudgingly giggled at the movement, his frame loosening with each laughing breath he took. Come, I've something I want to show you. He softly commanded his son, standing to his feet and lifting the boy by the back of his leather tunic, dangling him from his hand the way his father had occasionally done to him and Brandon as boys, back when Lyra Stark still lived and Lyanna was still safe in the cup of her belly still. Robb half laughed, half whined at the treatment, lightened mood lifting Ned's own. He carted his son through Winterfell just in that manner, past the guardsmen lining the halls, his lord's face hard won with Robb's giggles threatening to pull his own lips up. Caitlin they passed by the hallway that led to the glass gardens, her likely sensible conversation with Veonku and his second cut short by her horrified gawping at the behavior of her husband and his heir. He just winked at her and continued on, heading for the walk that cuts through the training yard, Robb now content to just swing nearly 2 hands from the ground, arms loose at his sides. Sir Willis Marndaly was the next notable person to see them, standing at the side of the ring and watching the Dornish knights and Winterfell guardsmen batter each other senseless. The portly knight was murmuring to his daughter softly, the older appearing bored whilst the younger one was watching the matches hawkishly before her eyes bulged and her mouth fell open as he and his burden strode by, Robb waving cheekily to the girls before a hint of his grandfather's furrow regained his brow as he spotted the contending men, Ned having to shake him roughly a bit before the boy looked away from the bouts with an outraged squawk. The older girl, Winifred, pulled a perfect curtsy at their approach, her sister still too busy goggling at Robb's treatment to remember to execute her own. Robb's pained yelping cut off instantly when the older Marndaly girl looked directly at him, his own face flushing red when her eyes fixed on the hand Ned had fisted at his nape. Enjoying the yard, Sir Willis, and my ladies of Marndaly? Ned intoned softly, as if he wasn't toting his heir around like a burlap sack of seed. Oh yes, indeed Lord Stark. Rumbled the Lord Wyman's eldest son and the heir to White Harbor. Seeing such fierce contests makes me wish I'd pushed my lord father for more men to accompany us here. The Merman against the Serpents, I like those odds. He positively boomed that last part, some of the other men witnessing the matches raising their brows at his words. And you, my ladies? Ned asked the girls, allowing a tiny smile to chip away the freeze he'd applied to his face. Do you also enjoy seeing these matches? The older girl seemed to consider her words, her face pensive as she thought. The younger had not the reserve of her elder sister, for she quickly let loose her tongue. Why do you carry him like that? The small girl asked, a fascinated curiosity spurring her rude inquiry. Tease not our except Tabubul. Her lisping snag on the last word reminded him uncomfortably of Lyanna in her girlhood, the wince he gave in response causing Winifred to clap her hand over her sister's mouth, and their father offered his apologies for her temerity, his own eyes looking askance at Robb's puppetry mummery even as he bustled them back inside, his scolding about how more girlish pursuits were needed grating to Ned's own ears. Shaking his head, he looked at his copper-headed filial baggage and then at the dark hallway that led to their hallowed place of worship. He put Robb down, allowing the boy a moment to straighten his tunic and adjust his breeches that had ridden up during his jostling toting around the castle. Ned walked ahead, nodding as he passed the guards who kept watch on either side of the hall that led outside, hearing Robb's small feet echo in the darkness as he ran to catch up to him, the calming scents of fir, pine and old earth greeting them alongside a welcome chilliness as they exited into the dimly sunned northern day. Robb wasn't the only Stark who missed the Godswood, for Ned felt his own tiredness and gloom lighten as the weighty stillness of the wood rested on him like an old familiar blanket. The years fell away from him then, his mind seeing the shadows of his siblings dancing around him. He took a knee on the hard ground beside one of the steaming pools that was scattered throughout the glen, letting Robb walk ahead as he took his hand and drew it through the dark waters, his reflection melting away at the motion. The water was warm when he ran that same hand down his face, not enough to burn, but it was always a shock to those unfamiliar with Winterfell. Opening his eyes, he saw Robb seated where Ned himself usually would, his head tilted back and eyes closed as he leant against the white bark of the heart tree, the grim face of the weirwood sharing a similar cast to the look on his son's small face. Ned wiped his sleeve across his face, the dark wool scratchy as it rubbed, and walked over to his son, gently shifting him to the side as he took his own seat before the heart tree, pulling his son to his side as they sat before the gods. His own eyes closed under the red leaf canopy, his back finding the familiar hollows and curves in the firm bark of the tree that they leaned against. The dearth of sounds in the godswood cocooned them with their solitude, a stillness that magnified the telltale beat of his own heart in his ears and jaw, a reminder of the life that was ever coursing through them. Robb was still as well, his normally almost tiresome energy absent now, his only motion a slow and steady fingering of a fallen weirwood leaf that he must have plucked from the heavy grass. "Do you hear that?" he asked Robb, eyes still closed as a cool breeze swept through the breaks in the trees. "I can't hear anything, father," was his son's mulish answer. "Just the wind, and some sticky leaves." His small hand crumpled the red leaf in its palm, the sound crisp as it met Ned's ears. "That nothing you hear is time, Robb," he explained, eyes still closed to the world beyond them. "Time that has seen countless stark men and women all find this place of thought and ease. My father was seen by these woods, and his father and so forth. Even men as hard as Theon the hungry wolf or Brandon the breaker found their place in this godswood, by this very heart tree. The weirwood tree is said to never stop growing, son, and we Starks have grown beside this one. No man nor woman will ever take us from Winterfell, nor take Winterfell from us. King Aeus the Mad tried, and it nearly broke his dynasty to do so. We are the North, and it will have no other." His hand cupped the nape of Robb's neck and gave a gentle squeeze. His firstborn laid his head against his arm and sagged into him, his breathing relaxing as they sat in quiet peacefulness. "What about Jon though?" was the tremulous question that Robb asked then, his head a warm weight against his bicep. "Can't the Queen or Princess Mother just order him back to the south? He never says it, but I know he doesn't want to go back there. He never had any good stories about his adventures there, not like he does here." His son spoke aloud to the fears that sat in Ned's own heart, the anxiety that first flowered when he received the raven announcing the coming of the Dowager Queen and her retinue. The North loved their Starks, and he knew his lords and people respected him, his stolidness and fairness, his adherence to duty and the well-being of his people. He did not doubt that should the South bare its steel at the North again, his call to arms would be answered swiftly and brutally. Where his uncertainty lay, was the musing of would they answer the call for the Sake of Lyona's son. He himself held a chaotic storm in his belly when he found his thoughts drifting to his late sister, and she was the sun in his eye when they were children. Did she have any ken what her actions would unleash when she ran off with her accursed prince? Was the predictably certain estrangement of her family counted in the cost of her love? How had she forgotten the words of their grandmother, her warning of what would surely befall the lone wolf? It was these unspoken doubts that roiled his belly whenever he thought of the dreaded day when his nephew, his lonely boy, would doubtless be wanted back under the hard eye of Princess Elia, exposed and alone once more. How could he send his blood back to that pit of knives and knaves, but worse still, could he bring the North back into the dark days of blood and steel, all for the sake of one boy? How could he put that one boy above the countless sons and fathers that looked to him for security, for safety? What was his tears against the wailings of innumerable mothers and babes? He opened his eyes and looked down, meeting the beautiful blues of his son, and found he had no words to offer. Nothing that wouldn't ring hollow to his own ears, for he carried the same threads of fear inside his own heart. He was saved from his own inability to comfort a small boy by the creaking of a branch above, which drew Robb's gaze away from his own, and Ned's eyes followed suit, peering up into the dark red leaves above them. A pair of large golden eyes stared back, a small brown face dappled with milky spots watching from the canopy above. Trickle. The reason his wife refused to venture into the godswood to find him, outside of the most exacting of circumstances. Catelyn had made it her personal mission to try and keep her children out of the sanctum, only allowing them entry when their father was already within. "You carry a heavy fear on your shoulders for one so young, little wolf," the fey creature whispered, voice soft like wind blowing through tall grass. Her slow descent from above was steady and smooth, her 4-digit hand finding easy purchase over the white-skinned wood. Rob watched in silence, his own eyes wide as she drew closer, but he lacked his mother's fear, for he sat unperturbed as the space between them closed. "Your father spoke as true as the stones of the river speak to the bank." She looked at him then and he nodded, a reverent tilt to his head at her presence, and she brushed a clawed hand across his brow in return. "The stillness of the gods there is the breath of time spent, and time carries its own songs, both from now and then. If you wish to protect all those who live within the beats of your heart, you must first be able to hear the songs that live around us. And hearing those songs, means knowing those who sung them. This will only be done, when the noise of your head is put aside." She ended it here, a black clawed finger softly pressing between his brows, where his newly constant furrow had made its home. She then reached into the brush behind her, pulling some odd tangle of twigs that reminded Ned of the prayer circles his wife made whenever one of their babes had fallen ill. Rob was as still as a stone himself when she approached again, her size akin to his own as she draped the woven branches over his head and across his shoulders, a shroud of shiny underwood that sat on him like a king's mantle. She pinched his cheek then, and touched her thumb to the furrow of his brow once more before scampering back up the tree and disappearing into the tangle of leaves and branches. "To help the Earthen Lord remember the Earthen songs." Her parting words sounded as if the shrubbery itself spoke them, leaving them both quiet in her wake. Ned looked at his son then, first seeing and then touching the mantle the filing had weaved and gifted to his boy, his fingers feeling the smooth turns of different shades of wood flesh that was almost twined like a fisherman's net, its gold and brown loops and black and grey swirls circling around each other but never finding a break or beginning. He worried for a moment about splinters, seeing where it rested against the pale skin of Rob, but his perusal told him it was for naught, as the feel of the thing was as if it had been oiled and rubbed for years by steady hands, something of the sleekness reminding him of the many toys he and his siblings had played with in his own childhood. Ned pushed himself to his feet and then turning, pulled Rob to his own from his too comfortable seat on the stone, groaning a bit at the ache his movement provoked. He then reached for the wood collar, only for Rob to step out of reach with a protective hand fixed to his neck. "Rob, we're going back inside and you'll not wear that at the high table," he told him flatly, his stern gaze intent of pinning his son to the floor. "Your mother would chew my hide if I allowed you to cavort around wearing a bramble necklace in front of the Dowager Queen and a Dornish prince like a wilderling." His boy took another step backwards, his own eyes hard as he met his father's stare head-on. "Trickle gave it to me, and you told us she came to us after you prayed to the old gods. So why should we care what some prissy southerners say?" His sky-blue eyes were firm with resolve, his mouth a thin line that reminded Ned of his own father. "Wood doesn't worry, it just has a will." The words of the child of the forest came back to Ned then, a dash of cold snow down his back that brought him back to that dark day in the godswood of Riverrun, where he cried out to his gods for strength and bounty and power. To help the Earthen Lord remember the Earthen songs. "And what will does Wood have, Rob?" he asked, an unpleasant tickle at the back of his tunic. "To grow," was all he answered, before he turned and left their haven for the castle proper, leaving his father alone and chilled before the watching heart tree. Asterisk 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 asterisk. Cat did not in fact chew his hide when he and Rob entered the great hall later at that evening's meal, and she saw her firstborn with his wooden jewelry, but she did appear to bite into the garlic and pear-flavored venison with especially vicious bites when it was set before them. Sansa and John just looked confused at the added eyement of Rob, while Arya toddled over to try and tug on it before her mother pulled herself away from the flavorful fare and scooped her youngest daughter up and into her lap, a withering glare impaling her husband all the while. Rob himself, the subject of more than a few stares past the high table, was beyond it all, his eyes looking around the great hall as if seeing it for the first time, his recent high dudgeon totally absent, a look of peace and contentment replacing his former unhappiness. Ned was so lost in his own study of his heir that it took Caitlin kicking him under the table for him to realize that he'd been ignoring the conversation Prince Oberyn had unsuccessfully been trying to have with him. "My apologies, Prince Oberyn. I find the rigors of children are an easy way to be distracted," he offered politely, his mind still on Rob and the title Trickle had given him. "No need to apologize, Lord Stark." The thick accent of the man was like a bell in his ear as the swarthy man waved his arm as if to emphasize his despair. "As a father of a few beloved children myself, it's exceedingly easy to get lost in them. Everything is so new and exciting to a child, where to a man or woman, so much joy is lost. Take your heir for example. He sits that chair like a king, watching yet not caring about the room that looks back at him. No insecurities to peel away, no fears to boil him from the inside out. Just contentment and surety of his place in the world, and none will take that from him. Odd taste in jewelry though." He drawled that last part, his black eyes moving away from Ned to the dowager seated to his right, his thin lips curling as the woman's admonishment to her daughter to stop staring and eat drifted over to them. Ned raised his own goblet to his lips, the black apple sour burning him nicely as it went down, his eyes on the small girl who stared with an almost burning curiosity at Rob and his bramble mantle. "We can wear adornments given by the earth, or we can wear ones taken from it, through the bodies of the poor and broken," he stated calmly, his words a soft yet heavy reminder to what wealth was begot by violence. "My Rob shows is a more earthen glory, as is his right as the blood of the first men, and one who was raised to understand the weight of all life." Prince Oberyn pulled a draught from his own glass, his eyes bright and glittering over the rim as he looked at Ned before he placed it back on the table. Should he remain so wise and retain his handsomeness, many a maid will fight for the right to stand beside him as the Lady of Winterfell. The prince offered smoothly, his hand teasing the bottom of the goblet. It was a signal, for one of his servants came and silently refilled the cup with more of the sour wine House Mormont was so proud of. Some who might even be called royal themselves. Let us hope that his wisdom will allow him to see when gold is placed before him, and not dinged and rusting brass. His lord father as well. Ned bristled at that, his eyes flitting over to the other end of the table where Sir Willis and his daughters sat and ate, the younger knight chatting with Sir Roderick, both men burly but only one running to plumpness. The heir of White Harbour's daughters were neatly eating their food, the younger one near dancing in her chair as she peppered her elder sister with questions that were undoubtedly about Rob, going by the way the eyes of both repeatedly cut down to his son as he held court with invisible courtiers, in the hall but 1,000 leagues past it at the same time. "There is always a need for gold, Prince Oberyn, but we must work to balance the better with the ideal. We can make much use of gold in the north for true, but at times, other needs must be considered instead." End. Chapter 15. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Chapter 15. The Wolfswood, of the North 292. Prince Oberyn Nymerus Martell. For the third time within the hour, he cursed his own blasted curiosity and incessant hunger for new experiences as the freezing wind of the forest shoved daggers of cold into his body. A Prince of Dawn had no business being in a place this cold or forsaken of any decent comforts. Only for Elia did he make this accursed trip, and it was only the memory of the gratitude in her eyes that kept him in this land teeming with boorish oafs and barbarians. He missed his girls, his sand snakes. Oberyn with his mother's frown and his sister's laugh, when she let down her guard enough to share it. Tyen with her pretty smiles and knife-sharp eyes that mocked the world. Nymeria with her braying laugh, the one she practiced so hard to tame without success. Elaria his love who he'd left with a rounded belly in the company of his sister, keeping the dull court of his royal nephew chittering about unworthy company and Dornish lewdness, yet half the courtiers stank of brothel musk and cunt cream. To his left, a goblet of the day's saving grace, Hunnemint Glide was pressed into his gloved hand, and he accepted it gratefully, his eyes meeting Asura's above the rim as he lifted it to his lips, allowing the smoky heat to pool in his mouth, pushing back the wintry blades of the northern air they were suffering in. For all that he was suffering in if not silence, something as close as he could manage, his sister's closest girlhood friend seemed to be weathering it much better than he, but she had her joy with her, whilst his own he'd left back in the Red Keep. Braina Dane, for all her Dornish lineage, seemed to glow throughout her time in the north. And Usurper seemed to find comfort in that pleasure, vicariously enjoying the north through her daughter. "Better Prince Obj?" she asked, her violet eyes shining with mirth at his apparent misery. "Obj is not a suitable name for a Prince of Dawn, Lady Dane." He smirked back, his warm belly pulling at the pretty flush on her cheeks the cold gave her. "It'd be like calling an illustrious daughter of the Torrentine Lady Ashias, and such indignities are inconceivable, yes." Her guffawed laugh broke through the quiet of the trees towering around them, and a shrike called in response, sending the horses they sat on to nickering. It made the dim morning more tolerable, this easy companionship that sprang from years of familiarity, and the warm bottle of northern spirits they shared between them. "We really should take more care not to use such colorful terms in front of these young ones, my prince," she admonished, her smiling eyes playful as they moved ahead past the burly line of Winterfell guardsmen to the two boys on their ponies, with their cousin, her daughter between them on a gelding. "My Braina has grown used to your peppery mouth, but I doubt Lord and Lady Stark speak so hotly in front of their own young ones." It was his turn to scoff, the horse beneath him whickering at the sound. "I doubt that the starch produced by those two is warm enough to put sweat on an icicle, much less turn an eye red." His chuckles were ringed in scorn and bitterness, and beside him Usurper reached out and squeezed his forearm. "Obj," she said softly, the warmth of her hand clear even through his woolen layers as she patted his arm in consolement. "Do not obj me, Usurper," he grumbled, his eyes squinting against the cold winds that pushed against their pitiful hunting party. "Both myself and Roller have made known the betrothal offers for those two boys right there, and these glacial oafs have yet to say anything in response. We make mention, he says they must have more time to consider. She says her lord husband must make the best decision for the north. We've been here for almost 2 moons, and yet we stand no closer to an actual answer than we did when we first departed the ship in White Harbor. As if these frost-bitten barbarians deserve the privilege of my sister's daughter as their lady. She'd be wasted in this queer-colored wasteland, with its heretical grass and tree landscape. Grass should be green and trees brown, as the gods intended." There was no swift answer to that, just more pause and sips from the shared decanter. "Some would say a land with blood-red grass and black bark trees is a land that cries out for a Targaryen, my prince." Lady Usurper at last mused, her face soft with something he could not name. "And at least here in the north, you can rest on the fact that any children of Robb and Rhaenys would not be used as a threat against Aegon and what children he has of his own body. Someone once told me that Starks have no want for the south, nor for the throne. They just want the north and to be left alone there." He looked at her then, seeing a brightness to her eyes that spoke to a soon-to-follow dampness, and then ahead again, seeing the small back of Braina Dane, all at once too pale for a Dornish girl with her long face and the thick brows she shared with all her northern kin, but here in the dim northern sun she nearly glowed like some woodland fee sprite. "Her father, I presume?" he drawled, his eyes fixed on the children scampering around on their small ponies, the guardsmen constantly adjusting their sprawl around them defensively. "I must admit, more than once I've lamented that it was your lover that was lost to King Scab's madness, rather than his dour younger brother. I can easily imagine that he'd have the wisdom and intellect to see when he was being honored beyond what this barren pit of a sty warranted. Our current Lord Stark seems to be a man of no ambition, his goals for his house appear to be nearly as flat as his wife's ass." Her laughter rang out then and ahead, Braina turned at the familiar sound of her mother's humor. "Oh Obj," she breathed, her cheeks red from the cold. "Brandon was a storm trapped in a man, and you cannot predict what storms will do. If Brandon didn't like House Targaryen, he'd sooner wed his prized heir to the daughter of his household knight than see Rhaenys walk through his halls. Send his nephew to Skagos than see him live as a hostage husband in Sunspear. Brandon Stark was rash, and it was that rashness that made me love him for a day. He himself told me that his younger brother was a glacier, mayhap simple on the surface yet beneath the water lies greater scale than one would imagine. If Ned Stark means to tell you no to both offers, then it will be because he considered them, rather than it merely felt good to say no at the moment." Up ahead, the party was stalling as Robb Stark was on the ground, poking at a burrow with a stick in his hand. His cousins were beside him, Jaehaerys solemn and Braina bored and pulling at the bark on the tree. "You sound like you admire Lord Stark, Lady Ashias," he teased, his hand out for the half-full decanter she was holding. "Best not let Lady Stark hear. Her blue eyes bear a lovely sort of sharpness whenever you're found within an arm's reach of him." "I do." Her confession was bald. Usurper was never one to simper. He wished to dance with me at Harrenhal but was too shy to ask himself. So, Brandon sauntered over and introduced himself, and secured his brother his desired dance. He stumbled and mumbled through it but was kind and sweet, but sweet was not what I wanted. I wanted swagger and fierceness, and I'd never seen skin so pale, nor eyes so silver-grey. And I had him for a night. And another night. And a day, and then too soon after he died. And now I have Brainer, so even if I had the lesser brother, he gave me my greatest joy. And I will never regret her. But Brandon told me of Winterfell. How it was a massive seat, with the accrued dilapidations of many an ancient castle. The abandoned first keep. The broken tower, tallest in the north but ruined in a storm 100 years ago. He frowned at that, his mind going over the spires and edifices of the massive castle, yet he couldn't place any that could be called ruined. "I can't think of any of the towers that might warrant the title of broken, Ash." She smiled sadly at that, holding out her goblet for him to fill after he finished topping off his own. "You're right, my prince. Lord Stark restored both the tower and the first keep over the years, and it was him that pushed for a resettling of the King's Road starting from Moat Cailin." She giggled at his confusion, her lips wet and glistening with drink. Guardsmen always babble when they see teats are big and necklines low. But indeed, Bran was a force of nature, yet he confessed he was not one for the lordly type of business, and he'd always planned to defer to his brother on that while he hunted, sparred, and kept his wife's belly round with more Starks. Ned Stark managed to do both the lordly thing and keep pumping more little Starks into his Tully wife. Even the winter town outside the castle has benefited from Ned's lordship. Bran told me it was half empty most of the time, only swelling with bodies when winter came heavily. Yet to see it now, there's constant trade happening there. Brainer has been pestering me to bring her to see the Yeti men who helped create the dragon toy for the princess. She insists on finding something to bring back home with her. She half-heartedly complained, a warm smile showing her true feelings about the matter. An alarmed shout broke through their conversation, and ever a man of action, Oberyn nudged his mount into a canter and pushed ahead, hearing Usurper following quickly behind. "Young Rob, come away!" yelled a burly guardsman who was aptly titled a Labelly. "Could be a Bettler or Padfoot you're poking at there." The man was using his outrageous bulk and the overworked steed that carried it as a bulwark between the other two children, his friend's daughter blackened brow making her look positively feral at the interruption to their play, where her cousin, his sister's undeserved shame, was satisfied to watch with his uncle's stony cast borrowed to his own face. Which then broke into a near-blinding turn of a smile, his resemblance to his accursed father never stronger when his red-headed cousin straightened and turned towards them with a solemn look on his face, only softening when he looked down at the furry bundle in his arms. The boy doesn't smile at costly gifts, nor sprawling feasts, but a mewling four-legged beast chips his iron. It was a shame that the boy was so intent on being a miser. He was blessed with handsomeness, something beyond what either side of his lineage could bring to bear, with almost almond-shaped eyes and a fine nose that wasn't so long as to be a flaw. Long, thick black lashes framed blue eyes even brighter than that of his mother, and while not particularly full, his lips made an adorable rosebud that as a man, would make him popular with women, both maidens and widows. Best of all, he'd escaped that most glaring and common curse of all redheads, the dreaded freckle spatter. Just pale creamy skin with a hint of flush around the sharp bone of his cheeks. But he ruined it all by only consenting to glare at the world around him, offering smiles sparingly, but for those he favored. Like a newly welcomed cousin from House Dane. "Rob, is that?" Brainer breathed, her warm breath steaming across the space between them, shortened since she'd urged her pony a bit closer to her cousin. He looked up at her and then back down to the small animal in his arms, which to Oberyn's eyes had an unsteady cadence of breath. "He's yours, cousin," was all the little boy, who at first glance looked so Tully but mannered so grimly he could only be a Stark, said, before he gently placed the creature in the young girl's open arms. The small girl was in love from the second it nestled into her arms, her eyes glistening with happy tears as she breathed in its wild smelly fur. Usurper, who'd been struck into silence since the boy first pulled the beast from its burrow, came to life then. "Your gift is generous, Lord Rob, but Brainer cannot accept. She spoke softly, her hand fingering one of the braids in her daughter's hair. The South is no place for a wolf, even one so beautiful as this. Besides that, the animal's pack will surely return looking for it. Wolves need other wolves, the same way people need other people. At that, her stroking of Brainer's twined hair ceased, and her hand fell to her shoulder, a reminder of authority that served to only make the girl hug the animal harder. "It has no pack, Lady Dane," was the young boy's rejoinder. "The dirt around the burrow is unmoved, aside from older tracks from days ago. Wolves will leave their young to hunt but return often to check on them. This one was alone for days. He was abandoned. A boy speaks but a greybeard is heard. And what great hunts have ye been on, young Rob?" One of the guardsmen escorting them jeered playfully, ruffling the boy's hair with a hairy hand. "Or is the maester teaching you wolf habits between your sums and letters?" The boy just glared at the man, pushing his hand away in indignation. "I just know is all," was all he retorted, his hand raising to tug on that queer bramble he bore around his shoulders. He didn't know what madness possessed him to intercede, but somehow he found himself before the girl, kneeling in the freezing snow to look her evenly in the face. "May I see him, Brainer?" he asked, making sure to keep his face and voice calm and steady. "I just want to look him over." She looked at him, then down at the wolf she still cradled to her chest, and finally back at her mother before she acquiesced with a frown, stepping closer to him as if to ensure he didn't try anything nefarious with her new love. Mindful of the girl's watchful eye, Oberyn handled the pup with care enough that even Brainer's furrowed brows softened, gently turning the animal on its back, and feeling its belly, the old lessons of the citadel coming to mind as he felt for worms, broken or twisted limbs, and using the back of his hand, registered its heartbeat. It was a light rhythm, barely felt through the gloves he wore. Opening its mouth, he smiled as it sought to bite his hands, the nips almost imperceptible through the leather protection as he checked the teeth. They're but small, and likely unable to even break the tender skin of a newborn babe. Lastly he waved a finger before its nose, his smile dying as he realized there was no chasing of the digit from the pup's eyes. They just stared straight ahead, a snowy white that swam with dull grey around the pupils that spoke to a blankness behind the gaze. Stark colors for a piteous wretch. It suits. He was left behind because he's blind. The little old lord then offered, his bright blue stare heavy on the animal as it mouthed at the leather fingers of the Dornish prince. Brainer's horrified gasp was an immediate sounding call to the animal, it instantly losing interest in gnawing on his gloves and nosing in her direction. The heartbeat Oberyn felt through his hands rising as her soft and gloved hands cupped the pup's head, fingers gently rubbing on the silken ears and the space between them. "'Tis a pity about the wee thing's blindness, but it's your father who rules in the north, young lord, and none but the Lord of Winterfell can say if a wild animal such as a wolf will be welcomed into its walls." Yet another burly Stark guardsman rumbled out, the brown bushy beard flecked with snow and silver. "It's no fair to the girl to raise her hopes, when the decision is near yours to make." Rob just stared at the wolf in response, his face still even as his eyes flashed with something that could be called shame, or perhaps chagrin. Brainer had no such reserve, instead glaring at the man who'd spoken the unwelcome, but honest, words, while Jon just looked enviously at the animal even as it stretched and wriggled in Oberyn's hands, trying to return to the embrace of the small girl. The yet unchained maester in him had him turning the animal rightly and setting him down back where it had been first found and gesturing for Brainer to stand back. As soon as its paws touched the hard cold earth the animal was nosing in the girl's direction, its feet wobbly but soon enough following its scent-affirmed directional cues. It stepped slowly, the lack of sight making it cautious, but it moved straight as an arrow for Brainer, only stopping when the lay of the land hindered it. The piteous yelps it emitted as it stumbled over roots and dips had the girl pushing forward to meet it, only the strong arm of her mother's childhood friend a barrier betwixt the two. Motherless by deed. My own girls would find this action cruel as well. His Oberyn would call it a pitiful thing, yet her firm arms would hold it close all the same. His Tyen would look past it, she had little love for pets the way most other children did. Sarala, the one who most intensely shared his great curiosity for knowledge and adventure, would steal from her princely uncle a pair of spectacles, to put on the pup's eyes as if that would make a difference. His wistful thoughts of his far-off family were interrupted by the soft words of his accursed good brother's bastard son. The bastard Waters seldom spoke in front of him, his eyes anxious and mouth guarded, but the plight of the animal must have bravened him. While Oberyn had thought on his daughters, Brainer had used his distraction to slip under his burring arm and gently pulled the wretch into her arms, its whine ceasing as it made itself comfortable in the snug safety of her arms. "It's like Rob said." The boy spoke, his words firm with a resolve more worthy of a man than the small child he truly was. "She is his and he is hers." The guardsmen scoffed at the overly serious words, muttering to themselves in overlude whispers about errant children and hopeless wants, and Oberyn couldn't find it within to disagree. He'd felt the softness of the bones of the wolf when he'd placed it on the ground. It had seemed to give off a pained sigh when released to earth, as if it couldn't bear its own weight. Even the heartbeat had been tepid, the vigor of its tail betrayed by the small breaths it took. It wanted to live, he could see, with the way it nuzzled into the girl, but he knew a lost cause when one crossed his sight. But Elia, his heart spoke to him, and his gaze swam instantly, the reds and blacks of the surrounding landscape melting into a blur of memories of his youth, with the ever-changing army of Maestas all poking and prodding his sister, their Princess Mola and Prince Consort Percy watching with grim faces, always the same report of "not long, she'll always struggle, it'd be a kindness to let her sleep it away." It was his Percy's fierce older sister who introduced him to his love of potions and poisons as a boy, when she'd caught him trying to slip a white-eyed dancer under the door of the Maestas' quarters after a particularly harrowing day of them maligning his sister's long-term prospects. Lady Elaide Gargallan had plucked the writhing serpent from his hands and casually sliced its head off with a priorly hidden knife, flicking the spewing fluids into an unused brazier. Clutching him by his ear, she'd dragged him into an empty pantry and cuffed him hard about the ears. And what would you do if this serpent ignored the leathery feet of those old fools and instead slithered back from whence you put it, and then chose to bite into your sweet flesh? Or worse, that of your sister? Her eyes were steaming black slits in her dusky face, the Gargallan nose with its snubbed curve and unfortunately hairy nostrils uncomfortably close to his face. Only a fool uses a serpent they cannot control, where cunning would tell us to be the serpents ourselves. "I will teach you, for if I don't your parents will surely bury you instead." And she did teach him. First by showing him the just rewards of sloppy handling of dangerous substances by pointing out intricate drawings of burned faces and melted hands in old dusty tomes, and then by procuring those very same liquids, her own treatment of such volatile elements sure yet respectful. She didn't allow him to touch until he proved his own consideration of the substances, his long hours of observance paying off in a teaching of patience, or at least more than he'd had before. The next time a visiting Maester had tut-tutted after his parents had spoken hopefully of Elia's future marriage and ensuing motherhood, the man had woken with his vocal cords melted together after imbibing an offered goblet that had passed by his hand. The next morning his parents had a mighty row, his sister laughed, and his hard-eyed aunt had dared to smile, in her own grimacing manner. Later she took him aside, to both congratulate and castigate him, her eyes hard as she peered into his face, noses nearly touching. "I did not teach you these things for you to maim or kill any who thoughtlessly disregard your sister's future," she stated, her breath hot on his face. "I taught you because you'd soon kill yourself or someone altogether innocent, bumbling as you were. But the passion of your defense of your sister is endearing, so remember this, Bosie, respect and admire how even the weakest of us struggle to live. Only a low beast is content to die easily. Honor your sister for how she struggles, even when it hurts. Honor your sister for how she struggles, even when it hurts. Honor her fight." He saw that same strength in the abandoned wretch, its steps ginger yet continuous after Brainer set it down at her feet, her cousins watching and speaking to each other in low tones as it wobbled after the girl as she took slow steps away, the animal seeking her with its sightless eyes cast in her direction. "What will you call it?" asked the bastard Waters, Roriger's shame. His stony grey eyes were still on the pup, at last finished circling and now merely panting in one spot, ears tilted eagerly as if it knew the young girl's arms were descending to lift it once more into her heat. She snuggled the animal once again, unconcerned about the dirt and mud clinging to the emaciated creature's coat. "His name is Bravepaw. He was alone but now he's not," was her answer. Their party split soon after, Brainer insistent on getting it back to the castle, or at least the Dornish camp they'd established outside the walls for the men-at-arms 3 weeks prior. Her young cousins remained with Lord Stark's guardsmen to await Lord Stark and the rest of his men, the boys watching them ride off with uncommonly grave eyes for one so young. Braina was a black-dressed blur at the front of their party, her new love tucked safely within her cloak even as she pleaded for them to go faster, for brave Paul was hungry, she declared. A little behind was Oberyn and Usurper, his own thoughts centered on the odds of the beast surviving the week. He was pulled from them by Usurper's own mutterings at his side, barely heard over the panting horses they rode. Ulrich won't like it, she said to herself, her lip twisted, and thin, perfectly arched black brows wrinkled. He did not want Winterfell to even know Braina, how much less would he desire her to bring a small portion of Winterfell back to Starfall. I want no quarrel between my lord brother and my daughter Obj. He stifled a sigh, the small back of Braina ahead looking much stronger than one would expect for a girl of 7 years. Usurper, I doubt the creature will last the week, he whispered, his words spoken softly for fear of them carrying ahead. It's been alone too long, and these lands have little warmth or kindness for mewling things. It's unlikely your stuffy brother will ever have to deal with more than a weepy niece on your return to the Torrentine. She grabbed him then, her hiss sharp and angry as she pulled him closer to her, ignoring the horses' outraged squeals and huffs beneath them. And you said nothing until now. You let my babe fall in love with a creature likely to die within days. Her breath was steaming as she seethed these words at him, her violet eyes sharp as her family's famed blade as she glared at him. He ignored her skewering stare and pulled his fur tighter around his body, the thought of the warm castle walls a more pressing concern. The girl was in love the second it stumbled into her arms. Usurper. He grumbled into the cozy cocoon he'd built around himself, his steaming breath warming his nose. If you insisted on separating them, all she'd do is resent you and try and sneak out to find it, no matter what punishments you threatened her with. Better she loves and lose this small thing, than risk death climbing from her chamber's window. It will hurt, but such is the way of things. He grunted then, their party soon spying Winterfell's walls, for Braina was truly flying, pushing her borrowed, overlarge hornless ox these Northmen mislabeled as horses through the thick snow before it as if it was merely dust. She was the spear point of the party now, the Dane and Martell guardsmen allowing her that honor as they cantered through the well-stocked winter town, her new charge more important than whatever clever toys the merchants from Yeti could offer. Even her mother's calls for her to slow down went unheeded, so intent was the girl to bring her companion to safety She plowed on, passing the massive gatehouse of the castle at a near gallop, only the shouts and yelps of the Stark guardsmen heralding her entry. It was only by the blessings of the Seven that an accident in the muddy courtyard of Winterfell was avoided, for they rode into a yard already occupied by another party, this one Braina's hasty arrival evidently startled from kneeling before the Lady of Winterfell and Queen Rolla beside her, the red-headed Sansa holding her mother's hand and the younger girl squirming on her hip. It wasn't a large party, but it was well arrayed, the men wearing the layers of plate and leathers that these northern lords favored for their men-at-arms, black and yellow cloaks around their shoulders and axes and long swords strapped to their hips. They were in a loose circle around a smaller knot of people, their stances protective and watchful. Behind the wall of steel and muscle, it was a tall woman who looked boldly at them, her dress muddy at the knees where she'd been kneeling, her gloved hand pushing something behind her. Next to her, a blunt-featured smiling man with mud-brown hair and honey-colored eyes, not much taller than her, raised his brown eyebrows at their noisy entrance, his own hand cupping the elbow of his companion as he bent his head towards her, his hair lighter brown than her shiny dark tresses, which she easily shrugged off as she stepped forward, her sharp grey eyes zeroing in on Braina at the head of their party. Her face was attractively striking, her brows naturally perfect in their arch and her nose almost puggish with a button-like softness, but the fineness of her features was offset by the square, mannish jaw she held. Thin lips and a cleft chin completed the unusual combination of looks she carried. Her eyes were welded to Braina and the animal in her arms, only to narrow and then widen when Usurper swept into a neat curtsy to the higher nobility in the yard, and then rose and approached her daughter, gently swinging the girl to the ground while minding the yelping creature tucked into the child's chest. The woman openly grimaced then, her husband's hand once again finding her arm and firmly pulling her back to his side, while the words he whispered into her ears steamed harshly in the cold air. That grimace turned into something like a smile, but it still showed entirely too many teeth, a white gleam under slit eyes that were cold and shrewd, something like disdain heavy in her countenance. A standard bearer beside them held a yellow banner aloft, and on it were two black crossed axes, and it snapped in the brisk chilly air. The end.